Tales for Dark Nights. Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Chapter 4. A Bird in the Hand. Just how fucked did this manage to get, and how did it manage to get this fucked? The general growled as his cigar smoldered angrily between his clenched fingers. The cabal of string pullers and commanders were rank in their clothes, all but the black-suited stranger at least, who had changed into a fresh, identical suit which had been produced by one of his silent retinue who waited in a windowless room down the outer corridor. The suited man sighed and looked over his shoulder. "Gordon?" The voice from the shadows spoke next. "We're not entirely cooked. Clearly he got his communication systems knocked out, but his locator beacon is still working. And we did get the fight we wanted. Sort of. We were supposed to bring him to heel by giving him an enemy. Now he's gone flying off with a damn near $1 billion piece of military hardware with an asshole inside of it. God knows what he'll do," the general bellowed in between moody puffs on his stogie. "I'm sure he's not doing anything too depraved to him," the admiral to the general's left said. "To who?" replied the general. "To Stillwell," the admiral clarified. "I don't give a fuck about that goddamn stooge. I want the fucking hardware back." "Gentlemen," Gordon said, concealed within the shadows, "I think perhaps we're missing the silver lining here. His locator is still on and functioning, which means we know where he is, which means we know where Supreme is." "Good. Well, let's nuke the goddamn freak and be done with it already," the general insisted. "That's really a solution to everything, isn't it, Arnold?" the admiral said dryly. "Go fuck yourself, Frank." "Fellas, I'm actually with the talking patch of darkness over there," the nameless CIA officer said, twirling a bit of his beard between his fingers. "Maybe we can use this. We know where he is, and it's likely his lair or headquarters or whatever. Looks like a dump on the satellite," the admiral chimed in. "It is a dump. It used to be a warehouse for a logging company. But at any rate, we know where he stays. That's better than nothing," finished CIA guy. "What about Stillwell, though? Why did he bring him there?" the man in the pristine suit inquired. "If I had to guess, I think maybe they're buddies. The way they were hurling those cars at one another, it looked more like a game than a fight, don't you think?" The CIA officer turned to the large screen along the wall, and with a tap on the touchscreen before him, played the evening news footage of the battle upon the Brooklyn Bridge. "Watch. They take turns, and then as soon as he zaps them, look, he looks like he didn't mean to hurt him. Then he picks him up and flies away." He tapped again on the screen, and it went dark. "If Stillwell is with him and they're gonna be buddy-buddy, all we need is to reestablish comms, and we might be able to bring him into the fold even easier than we thought." "So it all relies on Stillwell?" the general asked, his face contorting with discomfort over the idea. "For now, yes," CIA replied. "Well, fuck. Is your shoulder okay?" Supreme asked as Mark climbed back to his feet, waving his arm about in a vain attempt to stretch. It wasn't until a bit of metal groaned and Mark toppled over that Supreme realized he probably shouldn't have tried to pull the arm off in the first place. "Yeah, I'll be okay. Falling down in this thing sucks. There's like padding, but it doesn't stop you from feeling all the weight," he replied. "Sorry." "No worries. So, how'd you find this place? Mark asked, looking again at the building as the two entered through the large bay door. I just sort of flew around until I found somewhere that would work. Somewhere that no one would find me. I think it works, Supreme said, almost proudly, as the dust kicked up from their entrance floated in the air. Nice TV, Mark commented, looking at the gargantuan flat screen which sat out in the middle of the floor before the makeshift living room. Thanks, it's great for watching Pat's games. Want a beer or something? Mark sighed. I would love one, but... He trailed off, gesturing to his helmet. Oh, right. Shit. Supreme thought a moment as he glanced about, before his eyes came to rest on his bong. It was a tall, bright yellow glass piece, with various dots of color along the neck and base. Hey, I got an idea. You got like an air intake on there somewhere? Yeah, sure, I've gotta have one somewhere, Mark replied, feeling about on the helmet and neck of the suit. His finger brushed along something that felt very much like a vent, pointing it out to Supreme. Here, shotgun, Supreme said, taking a hefty pull from the large glass pipe. Stepping closer to Mark, he forcefully blew with a cloud of smoke in through what they had rightfully assumed to be the intake vent. You getting anything? He asked, between light coughs. Mark sniffed the air inside the helmet. Nothing yet, but... Oh, wait, there we go, he said, as smoke began filling the helmet. Taking a deep breath, Mark felt glad at least to enjoy some modicum of reprieve from his otherwise eventful evening. Yet, just as he exhaled and felt the fuzziness of the high begin to take effect, red warning lights and alarms filled the helmet as the suit's air hazard system kicked in. He simply couldn't win, and now more than ever, he knew it. After a few moments, the alarms went silent and the lights went out. It had given Mark a slight headache, though he was relatively certain it was there before. Regardless, between the exhaustion from the night's events and the apparent potency of Supreme's weed, he soon felt quite stoned, and for the first time in recent memory, quite relaxed. So, let me ask you, Mark began as the two lounged in the living room space of the large open warehouse. Supreme in his easy chair, Mark laid out on the sofa. What's the deal with all that Nazi stuff? Supreme rolled his eyes. I didn't know they were Nazis. I thought they were just fans. They seemed all, I don't know, patriotic and shit. Yeah, it's kind of their thing. Blood and soil and all that bullshit. But yeah, you need to watch out who you make friends with on the internet. This one time, I got to be buddies with this guy playing this crazy online fantasy game. And a few months later, come to find out, he chopped up his mom and stuck her into a freezer chest for interrupting his game. Fucked up, right? Damn, Supreme said, his eyes glazed over. He was damn good at that game, though, said Mark, absent-mindedly taking a drink from his recycled piss hose. Well, it's just... I don't get it. I don't get how I can win. I try to be a good guy, a hero, and I end up with half the world thinking I'm some kind of a Nazi and the other half thinking I'm some kind of... The Supreme made a sarcastic face and drew up a pair of air quotes so as to highlight how stupid even he could find such a notion. Anti-white commie or something. Shit. Sounds like you've been reading YouTube comments. You should never read comments. Everyone knows that, Mark said, nodding with his helmet, though the action failed to translate outwardly. Well, some of them can be nice. Mark smirked. Really? He asked dryly. Supreme pulled out his phone and began scrolling. See? Here's one. He cleared his throat. I knew I could trust in this guy as soon as I saw his choice in clothing. See? That's kind of nice, right? I don't know how to tell you this, but that Supreme getup of yours, it's Kinda what? Mark searched for the right words, not wishing to be too mean to his new friend. Well, it's kinda douche. It's like the go-to douchebag's uniform, or at least it used to be. It's a nice hoodie, Supreme replied, feeling subtly defensive about his broader brand and decisions. I'm sure it is, but is it really worth $200 or whatever? Well, no, but Supreme felt slightly defeated. Hey, don't worry about it. Fuck those people, right? Also, it's your brand. You're kinda married to it now. Might as well lean into it, Mark offered, sensing Supreme's disappointment. He wished in that very moment that he had had a stiff drink. There was one sitting mere feet from him on the coffee table, which seemed to double as a bar for the time being, as Supreme threw one shot after another back, seemingly to little effect. However, he could not imbibe anything that was not already in his suit, short of apparently bong hits, which caused alarm bells to ring and his head to do the same along with them. He found it sadly ironic that he'd accepted this job to get out of prison, only to be more closely confined and teased with the freedom of the world than he was in Rikers. Reflecting on his overall decisions, as one is like to do when stoned and depressed, he shrugged within the metal frame, feeling nothing if not consistent in his choices. So, what do you think I should do? Supreme asked as he poured yet another shot. I don't know. You mean like the media and stuff? Yeah, Supreme replied, throwing the liquor back casually. I mean, there's gotta be something I can do, right? Mark thought on this for a moment. Well, you could go on the offensive. With the media? Yeah, get a little proactive with it, you know? So I should beat up a news anchor? Supreme said before instantly realizing how wrong he was. No, I mean like a charm offensive. Go do an interview or something. Or, I don't know, maybe try a podcast, Mark suggested, as a brief and passing moment of claustrophobia came and went. Like, start one? Maybe. But it'd probably be better to just find one to go on. Like a big famous one. Not a bad idea. What about TV news? Cable or whatever? Supreme was liking this idea more and more. I guess, but that's kind of boomer shit, don't you think? Plus, you know you can never trust those people. They're just gonna play it up hoping for some soundbite to make you look like an asshole. Supreme nodded. Yeah, you're probably right. Hey, do you think I'm an asshole? Nah, not really. No more so than anybody else, Mark said, shrugging. To him, everyone was an asshole to a certain degree, himself naturally included. Well, thanks, I guess, replied Supreme, only slightly insulted. You're very welcome. So, how would I go about getting on a podcast then? I bet you can email him. Just tell him, hey, I'm the superhero guy and I want to come on your podcast. I'd be idiots not to book you. Alright, yeah, good idea. Who should I reach out to, do you think? Mark paused, thinking over it for a moment. There's Hogan. Hogan? As in Josh Hogan? Yeah, he's pretty much the biggest podcaster out there. I bet he'd like to talk to you. Supreme pulled up a video of the podcast, cleverly named the Bro Hogan Sideshow, on his phone, and skipped some 10 minutes in to get past the ads. It was a standard affair. Hogan, the host, sat smoking a cigar as he chatted with a guest who sat opposite him. In this particular episode, the guest was a researcher of some kind, and the two were discussing a history of breakfast cereals. You see, began the guest, take any popular breakfast cereal out there, Fruity Pebbles, for example. With Fruity Pebbles, we get it very obvious. I mean, it's plainly obvious, and anyone who tells you they can't see is a damn liar. But with Fruity Pebbles, we get an obvious nod and homage to our hunter-gatherer ancestors.
It's plain as day, and research into the Paleolithic dietary habits shows that they were the ones who learned and passed down the discovery that, yes, breakfast is the most important meal of the day.
Wow, replied Hogan. That is wild.
Indeed. Consider Cheerios. What's the main word there? Cheer. As in you feel cheer when you eat cereal. Now you'll notice these are largely all the work of Kellogg's and the original Dr. Kellogg. He had a lot of ideas. A lot of ideas that would get him cancelled today. And that right there is why those who are looking to subvert our dietary habits, oh, I call them brunch people, they're always the ones trying to shut down discussion about this,
the guest said. That is wild. Why do you think the brunch people have it in for you like that? Hogan asked.
Well, it's because they can't make up their damn minds. Do you want breakfast or do you want lunch? Because they're two very different things. Very different things. And to try combining them like that is to bring additional chaos into a system that relies on order. This is why those goddamn brunchists, it's also what I call them, brunchists, that's why they're so hostile to tradition. Their blood sugar stays low until they go out for their brunch, which again is technically breakfast, as the root words there are breaking and fast. So technically, they could hold off on eating until sundown, and that supper would still be breakfasts. And they just hate having to admit that to the world of breakfast cereals, this fancy culinary Marxism. You need to, well, eat your damn cornflakes. That's how you grow up and mature to be a big boy.
Wow, that is wild, Hogan replied. Do you think that's true? Supreme asked Mark, who was still lounging on the couch. Is what true? All that stuff he said about breakfast cereal. Do you think that's all true? Mark thought the theory over for a second, before dismissing it with a shrug. It wasn't that he had a definite opinion of it either way, but the notion of even a bowl of cereal was enough to inspire mild hunger pains. Pains he knew would only get worse. Pains he knew he could only answer with more recycled waste material. Oh, the glamorous life of supersuits. Maybe. Who knows? He said, sitting up in his seat. Gonna email them? Yeah, sure. Well, maybe this will help me sort of clear my name. Well, we can call it Nazi, or, what's the opposite of a Nazi? I'm not sure, Mark replied. Communists? I guess, but communists were crazy evil too, weren't they? Yeah, they were. So there's no actual good guys in that scenario? I guess not, but really, you're asking the wrong guy. Honestly, most of that shit is internet shit. I mean, like, I know there are Nazis and commies and they're real, but I don't know. It seems like a whole lot of wasted energy trying to be something like that. It's like being a bad guy in that way just seems like it take up a whole lot of time and energy. You notice political people are almost never happy. They do seem angry all the time. Yeah, Supreme conceded. What a shitty way to live. Yeah, and it sucks too when they try to draw you into their bullshit. As he spoke, Supreme felt as though his mind was reaching new heights and expanding to new places. He suddenly had a political opinion, which he'd never really had before, and it was that political opinions are dumb. It was a good hill to die on, as he'd seen said on Twitter, even if he didn't understand the overall irony to taking such a position on with such zeal and conviction as he had. But he felt righteous about it, and felt it was time to speak to the world. Supreme nodded, mostly to himself. Fuck yeah, he said. I'm gonna email them right now. That's the spirit, a still stoned Mark said, raising his metal hand in the sign of the devil. Supreme sat forward in his lounger, practically on the edge of his seat, as he searched the podcast's website for a contact email. As he did, Mark tapped his feet idly. The silence that had fallen made sense, but still made him uncomfortably awkward. Kinda surprised you get such good service out here, he said, attempting to kill the dead air. Huh? Supreme said, looking up from his phone. Your data service. You get service out here. Mark followed up, realizing how much he hated small talk. Yeah, it's pretty good. I just need to... Oh, yeah, of course, sorry. Supreme returned to typing. After some few minutes of entering his text, he held the phone aloft, shooting a selfie to attach to the message. An easy way, he reasoned, to verify to Hogan or whoever answered the email that he was indeed himself. There. And sent, he said, clicking finally on the send button with an unearned yet gratifying sense of accomplishment. Now it's just a waiting game. What do you want to do in the meantime? Replied Mark, starting to feel a little excited for his new friend. The Bro Hogan Sideshow was one of the biggest podcasts on the internet, and it would be cool to know his buddy got a chance to go on. Oh, we could shoot back to the city and do a team-up thing. Find some bad guys and fuck them up like. Mark wasn't actually opposed to the idea. Despite the exhausting beating he had taken thus far, his suit's internal medical response protocols had been, without his immediate awareness, gradually doping him up since taking the first real hit. It was not intoxicating, but it caused him to feel fighting fit despite numerous serious contusions, at least one broken rib, and with all likelihood an unaddressed concussion that he was generally unaware of. But, feeling fine, he did want to take another go at doing some super stuff in his super suit. The problem, though, was where he could go. If he was to show up in any larger American or even European city, his handlers, those who put him in the machine, might want to take it back. As much as he did wish to escape it, so long as he was wearing it, the odds of ending up back in Rikers, or worse, were greatly diminished. What about one of those wars? Maybe we could go help some freedom fighters or something, he suggested after a short think. Which one? There are loads of them, and to be honest, unless it's our guys fighting on one side, it gets kind of tricky figuring out who's who, Supreme replied, thinking back to that first foreign conflict and how messy the whole thing was. The two both furrowed their brows as they commenced thinking. Mark, as he found himself increasingly longing for all manner of things outside of his suit, and would need to figure a way out eventually. But at least he wanted to kick the tires just a bit more. Then an idea dawned on him that could serve both of these purposes nicely. What about, he began, going and hitting a drug cartel? Like, we fly into their compounds and just start fucking them up. Those guys are about as bad as they come. Supreme considered this moment, and a smile began to creep across his face. Cartel members were indeed the sort of bad guys no one would miss or complain about, and if it was anything like he'd seen in the movies, their bases were usually in remote jungle hideouts, far from any potential collateral damage or civilian bystanders. How will we find them? Supreme asked, considering that even though it may be broad daylight by the time they arrive in whatever country they were headed to, secret bases are usually made, so they were really hard to find. But his sidekick had just the solution. It had been in that moment he had decided that Mark was officially going to be his sidekick, and he'd surprise him with the invitation after they'd kicked some ass. You get me high enough over the jungles, my suit will be able to find them with, like, infrared x-ray shit. Then you fly in and drop me, and I'll do a whole superhero landing, and then you fly over and do your thing, and I'll never know what hit him. Mark was getting genuinely excited, partly for his chance to really play superhero, partly the steroids coursing through his body without either his awareness or consent. Supreme was sold. Rising from their seats, they shared an excited fist bump before heading out of the building. through the open bay door. Once outside, Supreme began by rising into the air and floating around Mark the mechanoid, looking for a suitable place to grab on. Behind the helmet, raised a bit between his shoulders, a thick metal bar provided Supreme with just the handle he was searching for. Picking his friend and sidekick up as one might a piece of luggage, Supreme soared into the sky above and looked down to Mark, who dangled rather awkwardly from his hand.
Which way?
He asked as Mark attempted to look up at him.
What?
Mark shouted back.
What way? I don't have a compass and it's still dark. I think that's south, right?
He shouted this time, pointing more or less in front of them.
Yeah, south,
Mark replied, pointing with a metal knife hand motion in more or less the same general direction. And with that, they were off. Supreme took care not to fly too fast lest he injure Mark further, but they still made it to the southern border, crossing over Louisiana and into the Gulf of Mexico in what felt like no time at all. Soon as the creeping light of early dawn began to illuminate the sky and the reflection of it upon the water gave way to land, a seaside town along the northern coast of Venezuela greeted them as they soared up and over the land even higher. Of course, Supreme had no idea he was over Venezuela in particular, and with his notably limited sense of direction and geography, he assumed he had flown over some portion of Mexico. Mark, on the other hand, found after this first hour that the flight itself was not as terrifying as he initially thought. It was even fun. During this time, he had managed to find a way to activate his heads-up display to show him his ongoing flight trajectory and GPS location. But beyond this, he realized that this was in fact the first time he'd ever left the country, and though he hadn't yet stepped foot on South American soil, he had technically traveled there, farther than he'd ever traveled before. Perhaps heroism had its benefits. Soon they crossed over into Colombia, where Mark was surprised to see his heads-up display lighting up with all manner of longer-distance target recommendations. It would seem in their deploying of the cutting-edge military supersuit, they had either forgotten to remove its targeting and intelligence credentials, or simply assumed Mark would be too stupid to access or understand them, the latter of which would prove to be unfortunately true. However, as they careened through the sky, Mark's metallic legs dangling in open air, a target alert populated on his display, and he quickly signaled for Supreme's attention.
What's up?
Supreme asked, coming to a mid-air hover, hundreds, if not thousands of feet above the surface. As he spoke, he lifted Mark up to eye level to hear him more accurately.
Just down there,
Mark shouted, pointing down and off to the right.
My helmet says it's a cartel camp.
Supreme looked to where he was pointing, seeing the small wafts of smoke coming up from the deep jungle within. Looking again to Mark, he nodded and offered him a thumbs up with his free hand, before lowering him again and beginning his descent towards the camp. Mark waved his arms again, causing Supreme to stop once more and again lift him up to eye level.
Okay,
Mark began, shouting even though he really didn't need to.
You come in kind of low above the trees and just drop me right in the middle of their camp, alright? Just right in the middle. Then you come around and laser them from the sky, and after that, we just tear through them as we want, yeah?
Supreme liked the sound of Mark's plan. More specifically, he liked the mental image it put in his head, with the movie of their epic deeds needing only a soundtrack, which Supreme imagined without hesitation. The actual physics to the maneuver were not even just a mystery to Supreme, but something entirely outside the purview of his thoughts. Nevertheless, as he zeroed in on his target, he began to slow down and drop in altitude. He didn't want to break Mark's legs, even if they were shrouded in advanced military armor. For Mark's part, the suit seemed to pick up on the idea of what they were doing, and immediately began flashing warning lights that their speed and altitude were too high to effectively make it drop. This was likewise lost on Supreme, who could neither see nor hear the flailing Mark below him due to his razor-sharp focus on what he had mentally come to call the mission. Mark knew it was going to hurt. Hopefully, it would at least look cool. Supreme felt his pulse began to race as he flew down into what he had hoped would be one problem-free act of superheroism of his career thus far. Marks did as well, as the alarms about his approach vector being less than optimal. Soon they came in for their final approach, and as Mark closed his eyes as tight as he could, hoping to salvage something of his landing, as much as hoping his spinal column might survive, Supreme let him go. "Just what in the hell are they doing down there?" the general grumbled as he watched the GPS coordinates of his army's very expensive battlesuit fly into Colombian airspace.
"It looks as though they're going in for an attack on a cartel base, sir,"
a nameless drone of an enlisted man said from the control desk off in a corner of a room most at the table had forgotten existed.
"Fuck me, really? Where is it?"
the bearded CIA agent said, slightly frantic at the prospect.
"Sending you the coordinates now, sir,"
the control operator said mechanically as the map and coordinates of Supreme's landing came up both on the agent's display as well as on the main screen.
"Subtle. Thank you, Private."
"We're soon to be private." "Fuck," the agent said, sparing him a venomous glance before looking to his display.
"Oh, never mind. No, that's not one of ours. I'd say let him blow off some steam and take the competition out."
The assembled suits and military brass looked at the bearded agent with looks that said both that they knew what he was talking about, but that perhaps he should say the quiet parts quietly, if at all. The agent unfazed. He merely rolled his eyes. Mark closed his eyes as he rolled as best as he could as Supreme deposited him into the soil of the now very alerted cocaine camp. On his way down, he noticed heat spikes, which told him that this was a processing station. A mix of documentaries and eavesdropping in Rikers led him to feel confident in his assertion. But as he tumbled, his hope for a straight-ahead, earth-shattering landing were dashed, as he instead tumbled for unknown yards at a time until getting his feet underneath him. Once he felt his balance again, Mark impressed himself as he steadied his feet beneath him, sliding backwards at considerable speed, his armored feet carving up the ground before bringing him to a stop. Mark stood up. Above he saw Supreme flying in circles, his hands thrown up in celebration upon seeing what was a very cool entrance. From there, Mark found himself frozen, unsure of what to do next.
"Hey!"
Supreme shouted from above.
"Remember, these are legit bad guys. No regrets, dude."
As the last word left his lips, Supreme paused and looked down to offer a final line of encouragement.
"You're my sidekick now, dude. Go nuts."
From there, Supreme wasted no time in drawing the bright red line of death from his eyes up and down the assembling fighters, who had already begun to open fire on both of them. It wasn't until the third or so bullet pinged off Mark's metal shell that he responded, firing a rocket directly into a nearby truck which pulled up with enemies aplenty within. The fireball which followed stopped him dead in his tracks. Never had he seen such destruction, let alone caused it. It was, in a word, awesome. Switching over to his flamethrowers, Mark painted the small structures and screaming narcos in fire, spinning in place and laughing maniacally. He was having the time of his life. Supreme was enjoying himself as well, feeling for once that he was relatively safe from both negative reactions to his heroing, as well as, for the most part, no civilians to get in the way. He had grown a little bored with simply setting the large encampment and cocaine processing facility ablaze with his eyes, and so opted to land. He sped towards an utterly terrified man holding a rifle aloft, trying in vain to fire it, not being old or wise enough to know what the safety catch was or that it was on. After a series of successive clicks, Supreme smiled and reached over, pressing down on the safety catch on the older model Kalashnikov and nodding. "There you go. Now try it." he said with a wicked smirk on his face. The young narco looked at the weapon and then back at Supreme in terror and confusion. "Come on now," Supreme goaded. Another moment of hesitation, and then, almost in what seemed like an accidental discharge due to nerves, the rifle went off. Supreme slapped his chest where the barrel had been pointing, dropping back as though wounded. His actions, though, far too over the top to be serious or real. The man with the rifle stood shaking as Supreme stood up straight once more, the bullet in his hand and a wicked smile on his face. The rifle dropped to the ground as the young man put his hands up in an act of surrender. Supreme glared at him seriously at first, then smirked and bobbed his head. "Get the fuck out of here," he said, shooing him away with a wave of his hand. The young man stood frozen in terror and confusion, before finally taking a couple cautious steps backwards, and then turning and running for the woodline at a full sprint. Supreme thought of burning a hole through his back as he ran, but then got distracted when he noticed the rifle on the ground, which inspired an idea in him. He had killed men with guns before, but what if? Reaching down, Supreme plucked the Kalashnikov and brought it up to his shoulder. Swinging the barrel around, he bent his knees and began lurching around in an attempt to mimic the sort of tactical movements of Navy SEALs as he'd seen them in the movies. He took aim at a narco emerging from around the side of a burning truck and fired. Several clumps of dirt, feet from the target, leapt into the air as the round smashed harmlessly into the ground. He tried again, taking closer aim and squeezing the trigger hard, hoping it would somehow make him a better shot. Again, though, the man continued moving, unfazed by the rounds which clearly missed him by enough of a margin to only barely be noticed. Supreme found himself growing annoyed. Looking at the side of the weapon, he saw the fire selector, and switching it to fully automatic, let loose as the heavy 7.62 rounds sprayed from the barrel. Several did nothing but pass above his target, with a few more thumping into the ground, before the final fuel from the magazine managed to hit their target, causing him to fall to the ground. This surprisingly felt strange to Supreme. He had killed many people already, yet never like that. Never in such a normal way. It felt odd. Yet as he picked up a full magazine from one of the dead bodies at his feet and, after some struggle, managed to reload the weapon, he found it kind of fun. A bit like a hyper-realistic game of Call of Duty, where he could get shot multiple times and still manage to carry on. In reality, this was more akin to playing such a game with cheat modes enabled, but that didn't bother Supreme, as he performed pointless shoulder rolls, poorly executed sweep and clear movements, and in general, acted more like a child with a water gun than anything approaching an actual soldier. As he ran about playing Special Operator, Mark found something wonderful, at least according to him. In the madness and chaos of the attack, the majority of those working in the processing and packing tents had wisely fled. Upon bursting into one of the large tent structures, expecting to find a host of enemies, he instead found a very large and very well-lit mountain of uncut cocaine left behind by the terrified workers. He cursed his helmet for a moment, before coming to what would generally be regarded as a genius-level bad move on his part. Approaching the large white pile of powder, Mark felt again for his helmet's air intakes, and upon finding one, turned his head and helmet slightly before smashing the side of it and its vent clean into the large mound of hard drugs. Alarms sounded, louder than the usual, as instead of a foreign substance being in the air system, its intake was entirely packed, causing a secondary set of pressurized clearance valves to open, blowing hard and fast from the helm. The blast caused the powder before him to scatter everywhere throughout the large tent. The alarms continued, and soon the same computer voice in his helmet spoke again. "Hazardous air contaminant detected. Initiating exterior purge," the voice said. Mark's eyes widened in a momentary horror as several flame jets opened along the frame of his suit, expelling short and massive plumes of fire, igniting and nearly vaporizing the floating cocaine. When the jets had stopped, a momentary whir of fans from the same jets were heard as the residual smoke clouded around. However, as the tent flaps were closed, most of the smoke lingered in the air, much of it making its way into Mark's helmet. He breathed deep, more out of a sudden terror than for effect, which rendered itself regardless. His pupils widened, his heart rate increased. Medical alarms regarding his physiological reaction to a plume of cocaine smoke filling his helmet sounded as his mind momentarily realized the intakes must have been an oversight when programming this response. He was, without a doubt, higher than he had ever been before. A rush suddenly overcame him, and he began bounding out of the tent space, guns and flamers ablaze as he took once again to the field of battle. This time, with God knows how much inhaled cocaine smoke was coursing through his bloodstream. He was a berserker in that moment, laughing and hooting with glee as his mounted wrist blades tore into and through the enemies he spotted, most of whom were trying to run away. An orgy of blood and carnage, accompanied by Mark's hysterical laughter, made even more haunting by the voice modulation of his helmet, ensued. One after another, Mark stabbed, swept, shot, or burned person after person, with no regard for if they were armed or fleeing. The bloodthirst, combined with his sense of invulnerability, had him leaping into fray after fray, so savagely that even Supreme to try and rein him in. After giving up on living out a video game behind rifles and machine guns he was shamefully unskilled and competent with, he had taken up 2 rifles by the barrels and was using them as dual-wielded cudgels. Much as with the swords in the mall and the rifles just moments ago, his actions with them were clumsy, inelegant, and most of all, useless. His arms would bunch up in attempts to swing the backwards weapons like war axes, with him shattering one of the wooden buttstocks as it slammed into his forehead under the needless and poorly aimed momentum he had gifted it with. It didn't faze him, though the momentary sense of embarrassment that washed over him after realizing how that must have looked did give him a moment's pause. Throwing down the weapon, he noticed that, in general, the area was largely cleared, at least of the living. They, however many there were, had legged it into the jungle in 1,000 different terrified directions, most simply hoping the villages they were plucked from with promise of work and money were still intact. Supreme surveyed the field. The only remaining action seemed to be coming from out in the field, out of view behind the large weapons tent. Screams of agony, terror, and the hoarse begging voices of those about to be snuffed out all filled the air. It was then that Supreme realized Mark had moved on from the main camp. Quickly observing a trail of body parts, blood, and viscera decorating the dusty dirt path that weaved its way through the small, hidden tent city, he noted that his sidekick seemed to be building a bigger, if not simply more aggressive body count than himself. He rose from the ground silently, rising just high enough to see out into the aforementioned field. It was more of a clearing on the edge of camp, really, stretching no more than 100 yards out before the jungle tree line took over. In the middle of the clearing, Mark could be seen, the mechanoid. Mark the mechanoid could be seen, tearing a screaming, previously armed man quite literally in half. He let out a hearty yet unsettling howl of violent ecstasy as the spray of blood and entrails coated his armor. Supreme, for all his violent acts and periodic bloodlust, felt a little bit like vomiting as he watched. It was excessive, even for him. But such was made worse when, while using what he assumed were servo-assisted limbs, Mark the mechanoid made a mad dash for the last of the fleeing survivors, following them into the jungle. Supreme thought he should intervene, that he should swoop in and reel his sidekick in, but for some reason, at least for a matter of moments of indeterminable length, he didn't. Flames erupted and billows of smoke plumed upward and out of the jungle canopy. The sounds of automatic gunfire and numerous loud bangs and kabooms could be heard from within the dense and seemingly impenetrable jungle. Further screams of terror and pain, many of which Supreme could specifically hear end in a gurgle of blood, or at least what he hoped was blood, cried out. And then, just as quickly as it began, it stopped. The silence was itself overpowering, deafening even to one such as Supreme, who in that stillness found an eerie sense of unease. It seemed to stretch out forever, until a successive crunching of soil and underbrush could be heard. Moments later, Mark the mechanoid emerged. His hunter-green armor was painted in wet, deep crimson, which dripped from the sharper corners of its build. The shoulders and chest of the machine suit heaved as Mark, still high as a kite, and now coming down off of a notable workout, stood bloodied and mad in the tall grass just beyond the trees. You get him? Supreme asked in a shout which sounded wary. You fucking better believe I got him, Mark cheered in response. Holy shit. Holy shit. I didn't know it was this amazing. This superhero stuff. Well, yeah. You went a little hard here. I did. Yes, I did. They had it coming. We agreed on that, right? Didn't we? Supreme nodded his agreement. The more to stave off any existential crisis or desire for more Mark might be on the edge of. Yeah, they had it coming. The two looked at one another from their respective vantage points as the camp around them burned and smoldered. Here and there, groans from the wounded and dying would arise. Mark turned his head, looking at Supreme, unsure if he should quicken them. Mark knew not of the term quickening the dead, but felt an urge to end them and their suffering all the same. Supreme simply squinted and raised an eyebrow. You okay, Mark? He asked. Shit, yeah. Never been better. Why? Mark said, his short words flying at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Just, you seem really into it. A little too into it is all. You sure you're good? Mark breathed heavily and rapidly. Yeah, man. Yeah, I'm great. 5 by fucking 5. Should we do another one? Supreme would have normally gone for it, but something in Mark's demeanor worried him. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something was strange. At that moment, he felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. It was exactly the get-out-of-conversation free card he didn't know he was wishing for. No! Shit! Hold on, he said as he pulled the phone from his pocket. He paused a moment and marveled at how, despite his outfit being torn up by gunfire, as was often the case, his phone had survived, with only a single grazing shot making contact with his pants some inch to the left of where it was. Whichever pocket it may have been in whichever direction an inch to the left might have meant, is left to wild speculation and fan theory. Punching his code in, Supreme saw a new email had arrived in his inbox. It was from the Bro Hogan Sideshow. Even in the sample text below the title, he could see they were excited he'd reached out. He looked to Mark and held up his phone. Brogan got back to me, he shouted. This managed to knock Mark's very fragile attention span completely off the joys of murder as he turned his head to the side and, within his helmet, smiled. No shit! What'd they say? He asked giddily. Hold on, Supreme replied, tapping on the email. After a quick moment reading, his face lit up like a birthday cake. They want to know when I can go on the show. Well, shit! What are you going to tell them? Mark shouted. I could do tomorrow. Should I tell them that? Yeah. No, why not? Besides, you'll need a new outfit. That one's a little shot up, you know? Mark said, gesturing wildly upwards towards Supreme. Supreme took a look down, seeing that once again his outfit had been shot to hell, and he would need another. Fortunately, upon his last commandeering spree, he had the foresight to take multiple stacks of his costume so as to have replacements when such became inevitably necessary. He nodded. "Let's head back," he said. Mark protested. "Really? Like, can't we just go ahead another one of these and then head back?" Supreme couldn't put his finger on it specifically, but it almost seemed like for some reason, taking Mark to another narco camp might not be a good idea. He eyed him a moment before shaking his head. "No, maybe later in the week. We did good damage here. I'm satisfied. Let's head back. I'll tell them I can go on tomorrow if they're willing, and I'd like to kick it a bit and get a shower in." Mark felt cheated, but relented, realizing his insane high was already starting to diminish. "Okay, just one thing first. Just 1 minute," he shouted up to Supreme. Supreme raised his eyebrow again, but merely shrugged. Mark shot him a very quick thumbs up before scrambling full speed back to the camp and into one of the still-standing tents. A burst of flame and smoke erupted from within, and it smelled simply terrible. It was like melted plastic mixed with burning Tylenol, combined in the perfect way to make any individual who smelled it think it was made specifically to offend their senses alone. Moments later, Mark emerged from the tent. His armor, which was still caked with blood, now blackened as though it had been through a barbecue smoker. He let out a whoop as he did. "Ooh!" he shouted. All right. Let's fly, baby. Mach 10, Mach fucking 20, boy!" he shouted, raising his arms in victory. Supreme wasn't sure what to make of this, but picking him up by the shoulder strut he had on their way down, he took the two of them off at speed into the sky. For the first half of the flight, Mark was a wriggling mess of excitement, constantly insisting they go faster. Even with the wind speed, Supreme could still hear him chattering and blathering away in excitement. "Did you notice how they all seemed to be wearing masks? Wasn't that awesome? Like, it made it so much easier to just plow through them like the spawn of a fucking tank to fuck the freight train, you know? Man, that was something. I get it now. They always put masks on the bad guy henchmen in movies. It's so like they are, like, people. Like, I haven't even thought about who any of those guys even were. Like, they might have had families and shit. And..." His rambling began trailing off for a bit, but not before returning as one thought was quickly replaced entirely with another. "But, yeah, it was like a fucking video game, man. I was like, all hacking and slashing, and then the flamethrowers, and just lit the place up, and fuck, this shit's amazing, man." Supreme took to zoning out to the white noises of their travels. At some point, Mark grew quiet, then, as it seemed, went limp, hanging like a rag doll. Supreme didn't ask any questions, and instead focused on following the coastline until he could recognize Boston Harbor, and from there, another speedy flight northwest to the abandoned warehouse of solitude. He had things to do, important things. First of which was a shower and a change of clothes. Bullet holes aside, by the time Mark had stopped fidgeting, a good deal of narco viscera had flash frozen to his body. It was rather uncomfortable, and were it not for the airspeed, would likely have smelled terrible. At the undisclosed power table, deep below the earth, beneath an undisclosed mountain, the room was choked with nervous cigarette, but mostly cigar smoke. The cabal sat silent, some on the edge of their seats, worried of an impending strike of some kind, but most simply lounging and enjoying the show. Supreme had proven to be more of a loose cannon than they had hoped, and as for their stooge Mark, though he'd failed to bring Supreme in the way they'd hoped, offering him a position on a super team that would serve as a smokescreen to ensure their control over him, those with minds for plans and plots saw within him still great potential. "They've left Colombian airspace and are moving rapidly back northward, sir," the nameless enlisted lackey at the computer station reported. "Our agent is experiencing heart arrhythmias. His vitals are concerning." "Could probably just blow some yayo while butchering narcos. Nothing out of the ordinary," CIA said nonchalantly, as though everyone had such an experience. The general turned to speak over his shoulder.
What's your little punk's name?
Not sure. Mike, or something like that. Gordon, the voice in the shadows, replied with a chuckle.
What's your blackest black side?
The general asked of CIA.
You mean Peachtree?
CIA replied. The general scowled and bit down on his cigar.
No, the real blackest.
CIA paused, but then quickly dropped the front and shrugged.
Sure, Blackbriar. When this is all over, I want that dopehead piece of shit in there tongue-punching ISIS asshole for shit paper for the rest of his life.
The general growled. CIA merely shrugged again.
Well, that all depends, I guess. Depends on what? On how long the kid can live off his own recycled piss and shit. He might get a little high here and there, but that is otherwise a closed system. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Engineer, he added, snidely, as the unnamed corporate overlord in the beautiful black suit. The man merely smirked and nodded. At his present rate, his body will begin to shut down within roughly 2 weeks' time. We designed these suits for long-range expeditions, but they weren't made to be worn indefinitely. Well, hey, tell me honestly, did you fix the piss tube? CIA asked with a bit of a crass smile. I'm sorry, Mr. whatever your name is. That is proprietary information, and I'm not allowed to disclose it. You understand? As he spoke, he returned CIA's grin exactly, giving him the chuckle he desired, without having to say a word. Sir, we've intercepted one of the target's emails. It appears he'll be appearing on a podcast tomorrow. The nameless soldier at the screen announced.
Podcasts? Grumbled the general.
Yes, sir. The Bro Hogan Sideshow.
Oh, I love that one, Frank, the naval admiral, chirped with excitement.
No one cares, Frank. So how do we make this work to our advantage?
The general barked in reply.
I might have an idea,
said CIA calmly.
But you might not like it.
Chapter 5. Two in the Bush. By the time they arrived back at the Warehouse of Solitude, the frozen yet slowly thawing chunks of bad guy still stuck to Mark's armor and the clinging bits hanging from his own tattered clothing had already begun to smell unbearable. At least, Supreme hoped that was it, as he would briefly catch a whiff of a much fouler and more alive bodily stench that he did his best not to think about. Mark was clearly unconscious as upon landing. He managed to remain standing, but only after Supreme had balanced him on his feet, hearing a slight whirring sound as the emergency servos in the legs and back of the suit locked up so as to keep him standing. He was unsure as to what the actual function of such a feature might be, not knowing it was required for when the machines and technicians were to take the suit off of its operator. But as the putrid stench of human offal again filled his nostrils, his interest in pondering it further waned rapidly. He looked about for a hose, before remembering that the odds of there being still running water to this old and derelict building were slim to none, with none in favor. Knowing that neither he nor Mark, when he woke up, would be able to tolerate the state of him for very long. Typically, Supreme would either shower at his old apartment or at the gym, which was but a mere 10 minutes flight away, keeping his drinking and daily use water in a large jug he had acquired. But this was a job for a hose, or better still, a power sprayer. It was nearly midday, meaning his usual habit of liberating retail items under the cover of darkness would not be possible. At least, he then realized. Not in this time zone. Usually leaving a note to let store employees know nothing had been stolen, but merely commandeered by the world's greatest superhero, Supreme wondered how far he'd have to fly to get to the time of night he relied upon. And furthermore, if they'd speak enough English to understand his note. Ultimately, he put all these concerns aside as the stench seemed to be getting worse as the frozen bits continued to melt. Periodically, during their flight, Supreme felt an odd vibration coming from Mark's suit, yet now standing in the quiet of the nowhere they inhabited, he could hear more clearly that such was the sound of exhaust fans, which he immediately smelled more clearly as well. It was a rancid mix of scents, ranging from burning plastic up through obvious human waste. It was enough to launch him into action and into the sky. Flying free of any cargo or passengers, Supreme rocketed upwards until he could see the blue of the sky around him begin to fade to darker hues and soon blacks as he found the upper atmosphere. Then, feeling proud to have maintained his bearings, shot off in an eastern direction at incredible speed. He looked down and watched as the sunlit lands of day soon gave way to the illuminated landscapes of urban night below. After some more time traveling, he soon observed the sunlight beginning to peak along the horizon. It was the literal dawn of tomorrow, and it was nearly upon him. Glancing down, he noticed large portions of darkened land spread between the glowing plots of city lights, and as he descended, he came to notice that throughout the darkness were dimly lit sprawls of suburbs and rural landscape. This, he thought, was perfect, and he descended silently even further, slowing his speed so as to take in what he could see. Then he saw it. The darkened lot and windows of what he could tell was some sort of large hardware or general farming supply store. It was perfect. Mark suddenly jolted awake as the crashing sound of water hitting the metal exterior of his suit filled his ears. His head, seemingly already deep in the midst of a splitting headache, found the crashing sound all the worse for his wear. His eyes felt like they wanted to bleed, and his nose was filled with the acrid stench of liquid excrement, which he could feel as his suit seemed to be struggling with recycling the volume and consistency of it all. He raised his arms defensively as he found himself unable to see past the rushing spray of water. As soon as he had, the water stopped, and before him stood Supreme, holding an industrial pressure washer. His whole body ached, and every joint and muscle burned. He tried to shake his head so as to clear his blurry vision and blurrier thoughts, but the motion only resulted in agony. What are you doing?" he asked blearily through the mask. "Hosing you off. You got covered in a lot of bad guy," Supreme replied, returning to spraying Mark down. Looking around, he noticed what appeared to be a brand new power sprayer beside a large vat of water, in which a hose had been placed for water to be drawn by the whining gas-powered machine. He squinted, allowing his eyes to at least attempt to focus, and noted that all the lettering on the side was, as far as he could tell, Chinese. "Why did you get a Chinese power washer?" he asked, slightly confused by the minutiae of the moment. "They were the only place that wasn't open," Supreme replied, still spraying Mark down. The chunks gave way to bits, and soon the bits gave way to slick reddish-brown liquid as it was sprayed back from the metal exoskeleton, coming off almost tar-like, as though it had been mixed with some form of powder base. Soon enough, though, Mark the Mechanoid was as clean as could be hoped for. Wrapping up the hose after letting the pressure out, Supreme carried the machine inside. Mark, aching with every step, followed. As he made his way towards the couch, which he was utterly desperate to collapse upon, Mark noticed a rack of identical Supreme label outfits, all hanging neatly, still in the original plastic wrapping from the factory. Crashing onto the couch, which groaned and cracked slightly under the weight he'd forgotten he carried, he eyed the collection curiously. He spoke in what could be described as both a grunt and a sigh, which somehow he managed to sew into words. So, where'd you find all that Supreme gear? He sigh-grunted. Supreme looked over to the rack. Oh, so check this out. I found this, tractor or farm store over in bumfuck China, right? And so I grabbed the power washer and bucket and stuff. But then I noticed nearby there's this really, really, really big building, like a factory. And everything else was closed, but these guys, there was like an army of these Chinese people all sitting at sewing machines, and it was like 2 or 3 in the morning. Anyway, I just wanted to check it out, and inside there were just stacks and stacks of them, Supreme recounted. Stacks of Chinese people? No, stacks of the merch. Weirdest thing was when I flew through an open window, the place had this big net that went around the whole building, like for circus acrobats, you know? Anyway, after I got in, I'm flying around on the ceiling trying to be quiet, and I see like 3 or 4 people just look up at me and not so much as shrug before going back to work. So I land, and there was this angry-looking floor manager person, but he took one look at me and ran off to the office. No one else seemed to even notice me. So I took a nice stack from the pile and brought it all home in the bucket. The matter-of-fact way Supreme recalled the story, both in regards to its clear ignorance as to what said situation was, as well as how unusual any story about flying halfway around the globe like that and floating into a Chinese sweatshop like Peter Pan after burglarizing a farm and tractor store could be, baffled Mark. Yet in that moment, he had neither the interest nor the energy to explore the matter more. With an achy nod and a painful shrug, he replied simply, "Oh, yeah, that's fucked up. Good score, though." Supreme took a fresh set of his outfit and, tucking it neatly into his backpack, also then included some soap, shampoo, and basic toiletries. "Headed to the gym," he said, almost anticipating the question. "The gym?" Mark said, baffled as to why the world's strongest man would go to the gym. "Yeah, if I showed up dressed like this, most people don't even notice, since I just look like another dude at the gym. And since I'm going on Hogan later, I figured I should take a real shower as opposed to, well," he explained, nodding in the direction of the metal bucket with a rag hanging limply upon the rim. "Ah, huh. Well, I'm just gonna lay here and suffer, I guess. I'll try and stream the show later if I'm still conscious or something," Mark replied blearily. Supreme foisted the pack onto his back and with a nod set out. Stepping out below what was a beautiful blue sky, he guesstimated the direction of the nearby town where the gym could be found. Then, kicking up a whirlwind of dust and pine needles as he did, shot up into the sky. The flight was very short. He landed out of sight and after a short walk around the building entered the gym, presented his key tag and headed straight for the showers. After a long and refreshing shower, Supreme stepped into the small privacy room, donned his cleanest set of sweats, socks, jocks, and sneakers, and with a polite nod to the front desk clerk, whose eyes never left her phone, jogged back to the more secluded location he'd landed in before, taking off once more. This time he was flying with earbuds in his ears. They were the sort of super sport variety, with ear hooks to keep them in place during vigorous activity. Flying at speeds which rival or surpass most military aircraft, this, along with the noise-canceling feature, was essential. He had become familiar with the brand after hearing their name spoken ad nauseum by seemingly every online influencer under the sun. Finding and then commandeering a pair during one of his routine supply runs, he was impressed that they were more or less seeming to live up to the hype. As he flew along considering this, with the newest track from rapper Lil Sniffles playing in his ears, he wondered if he should give the same consideration to one of those mobile games he was routinely hearing about from the very same influencers ad nauseum. Though these thoughts were short-lived, as the shrill robotic voice of his GPS instructed him to adjust course. He was Dallas-bound, headed to the sprawling multi-million-dollar compound of famous podcaster and BattleBot commentator Josh Hogan. The property was massive, with large metal palisades surrounding expansive tracts of perfectly manicured lawns, which came down in large tiered levels stretching from the palatial mansion above to the dock and boathouse sat along the shore of a beautiful blue lake. He had to pause and take in the sight of it all, as he had seldom been this close to such opulence and had never been invited inside. As he looked down, he saw as a short, stocky, yet muscular man with a shaved head stepped out onto the grand polished stone patio at the back of the main house. He puffed on an expertly rolled blunt, his red stoned eyes concealed behind big black sunglasses. He smiled as he looked up to his guest, who slowly descended from the sky. He, like most people on Earth, had never seen a person fly like that before. Seeing it while really stoned, however, made it even cooler. He pulled a heavy puff from his blunt and blew it up above his head as Supreme came to rest on the patio a few feet from him. His smile broadened. Hogan said, smiling at Supreme. "What?" Supreme replied loudly. "What?" Hogan replied. His voice was muffled. Then Supreme remembered the earbuds. "Sorry," he said, still above normal volume. Removing the earbuds and slipping them into their case, he smiled at Hogan and extended his hand for a shake. "Sorry, forgot my... it's nice to meet you." "Nice to meet you too, bro. You get high?" Hogan replied, shaking Supreme's hand with a grip he could tell he hoped would impress, before offering him the blunt. "Yeah, sure, actually. That'd be cool," Supreme said, accepting and hitting the blunt heavily. It was good weed, but that was to be expected. "Really nice place," he struggled to say while holding in his hit. Soon he exhaled and began coughing heavily. Hogan laughed. "Thanks, man. So hey, let's not fuck around too long. I like to keep the conversation for the podcast, so come on in," he said warmly, ushering Supreme in through the large glass doors and into his palatial home. Supreme thought it looked beautiful, like a really expensive hotel lobby, or something he saw in some bullshit influencer's click-clock account. Soon they made their way down a long, polished stone hall with all manner of expensive furniture and other random items that he didn't recognize or understand. There were lots of chairs, he thought, as they strolled the 20 or so yards of the large hallway, and Supreme began to wonder if sitting in the hall was a thing they did in his house. Before long, they descended a flight of stairs into the basement, which upon entering at first looked like a roadhouse nightclub of some kind, with multiple rooms all surrounding a larger main section in which sat a large table. All across the table, microphones reached out like black spindly arms to empty seats. Hogan took his usual position in the front of his red neon logo, which hung upon the wall. Supreme took the seat across from him, the same spot he'd watched the breakfast cereal professor talk about brunch. Settling in, he looked over and nodded to Jason, the producer, who sat quietly off camera, preparing all the technical parts Supreme could not even begin to imagine understanding. The two seated, Hogan puffed his blunt again before looking to his producer. The man worked furiously, setting and checking the necessary sound levels, camera inputs, and of course, opening 50 tabs on his browser, all awaiting for the inevitable call to pull something up. After a few moments, the engineer nodded, and the show began. "So, hello everybody," Hogan began. "I'm here today with the one, the only, the man, the myth, the legend, the world's only superhero, Supreme. Supreme, how you doing, buddy?" "I'm doing pretty good. It's nice to be here," Supreme replied. "Well, thanks for coming out. When I saw you flying in, I gotta say, That was some of the wildest shit I have ever seen. How far did you come to get here? I flew from northern New England, said Supreme. Well, like Massachusetts? New Hampshire. Wow. You flew like all the way, literally across the country. That is wild. How long did it take you to get here? I don't know, like maybe an hour or so? Hogan's stoned and lightly bloodshot eyes widened as much as they could as he stared in disbelief. A smile, a stoner smile, slowly crept its way across his face. You flew across the entire continental United States in a couple of hours. Yeah, maybe like an hour and a half? I don't know, I didn't really time it. You must have been going like crazy stupid fast, right? Yeah, I fly pretty quick. Just this morning I flew from New Hampshire to South America, and then back, and then went to China, Supreme recounted, before being cut off once again by Hogan, who was pouring himself a stiff glass of scotch. You went to China? He asked, pouring a second glass and sliding it over to Supreme. Yeah, but thanks, he said, taking the drink. He took a sip and found it peaty and smoky and kind of tough to drink. What was that like? What, China? Yeah, Hogan nodded. Well, it was nighttime, so it was dark. That is crazy, Hogan replied, seemingly out of habit. So listen, there's this big burning question that you know I've got to ask you. How'd you get your powers? Oh, well, so I was... Hogan cut him off again. Are you an alien? He asked, taking another pull from his still smoldering blunt. What? Supreme asked, a bit confused. An alien? Are you a space alien? Is that why you have powers? Hogan narrowed his gaze into a look that could almost be described as serious. No, I'm not, Supreme replied, his voice rising at the end expressing his bewilderment. You know that's what a space alien would say, right? Hogan said, his face again splitting into a jovial stoner smile. I guess, yeah, but I'm not a space alien, no. Hogan chuckled again heartily. You don't look like one, but then again, who knows, right? No. Can you fly in space? Hogan asked, not aware of how he was already pivoting away from his own first question. I think so. I've gone pretty high up there. Ever see any aliens? Supreme furrowed his brow. No? I bet there are aliens up there. Like, up there right now. How about you? You believe in aliens? I don't know. Maybe? Without missing a beat, Hogan began a long and meandering discussion about UFOs, alien abductions, and space travel, somehow then segueing into discussions of the Yeti and other cryptids. This went on for the better part of 20 minutes, all of which Supreme found himself thoroughly lost within. It wasn't until Hogan brought the conversation back around that he even had a clue as to what to say or how to respond. The scotch was strong, and so was the weed, though even with a clear head, it would have been unlikely much more would have been really landing with him. I bet a Yeti would make a badass sidekick, Hogan continued. Can you imagine that? You and a Yeti fighting crime together? How awesome would that be? Supreme thought about it, and had to agree. It would be awesome. Don't suppose you know where I can find one, do you? He joked. Hogan laughed. If I did, I'd be rich. Supreme looked around the very expensive studio space. Well, richer, Hogan clarified with another chuckle. So straight up though, have you met any other superheroes? Across the country, laid up on the couch in the warehouse of solitude, Mark was suffering. The combined post-narcotic hangover, coupled with his deteriorating digestive tract and the overwhelming stink of his own days-old perspiration, had him immobile and in substantial discomfort. while he lay in what was increasingly beginning to feel like a metal sarcophagus, sweating, bleating, and wishing for a long hot shower and a real meal. He used the suit to tap into the data network they were fortunate enough to have, and found and tuned into the podcast as it aired live. He briefly paused from dwelling on his suffering to notice that, for all the other features he had to contend with, the stereo audio within the helmet was rather impressive. First Hogan spoke, then Supreme replied. "Yeah, actually," Supreme began. "Just one. It's my buddy Mark. Mark the Mechanoid. Hey, Mark!" Mark attempted to smile, but found himself lacking the energy to do even that. Raising one metal arm in celebration, he bleated weakly through grunts. Yay! This made his throat hurt, and he instantly regretted the decision. Back in Hogan's studio, Supreme took another pull from the scotch. It was quite good and warmed his core. Before resuming the conversation, he momentarily made a mental note to ask for a bottle to fly home with, so as to try sipping for that rush of warmth while careening through the lower atmosphere. "So he's a mechanoid guy, you say? Does he have, powers?" Hogan asked. "Well, yeah. He's got this suit that's like a tank. It's got rockets and guns and flamethrowers and all that." "Oh, shit. Was that the guy you were fighting on the bridge?" "Yeah," Supreme replied. "Though it wasn't really much of a fight. We were mostly just throwing burning cars at each other. For fun?" "Yeah, pretty much." "Man, that is wild," said Hogan. "So, you haven't seen the other things in the news about these other heroes that have been popping up?" Supreme raised a confused eyebrow. He hadn't heard such, but then again, had been rather busy lately, and had made a point to ignore the internet since his last debacle in misreading a situation. "No," he said. "Holy shit, yeah. Jason, pull that shit up. The one about the Harvey Popper chick." Harvey Popper was a long-running children's series about a group of child wizards who were forced to go to summer school for their constant misbehavior. Over its decade and a half, it had amassed an enormous cult following, but had recently come into marketing difficulties after the original author was found to have been attending meetings of people with particular opinions about Jews. Supreme was familiar with both the series and controversy, and wondered to himself if she hadn't simply failed to read the room as he had done. "Check this out," Hogan said, as he turned to the large TV at the end of the conference table. "So, she found they sold these wand toys online that you can shoot little fireballs out of. So she gets one, gets the whole costume together, and then, well, just watch." On the screen was a somewhat shaky video, clearly taken on a cell phone. It looked to be in LA, though Supreme couldn't be sure as he was woefully under-traveled in conventional terms. The video began with the camera person filming their friend at a cafe outside on a patio, chattering about this or that. Suddenly, though, an alarm can be heard from behind them. As the camera moved and zoomed in, it was observed that across the street was a bank which was clearly being robbed. Two men in masks with guns drawn and duffel bags beneath their arms burst out through the front doors and began running down the sidewalk until they stopped dead in their tracks. The camera zoomed in further, showing the figure that had stopped them. There, a young woman, garbed in what looked like either a badly homemade costume or the cheapest thing available online, dressed as some sort of sorcerer. She raised a stick in her hand, and after shouting something which the microphone could not clearly pick up, sent a small flaming ball flying at the black-clad and armored robbers. The tiny fireball, which looked only slightly smaller than a golf ball, harmlessly bounced off of one of the bank robbers' armor before falling to the ground. The flame had died even before the paraffin paper wad even hit the floor. The robbers looked to one another, baffled as to what had just happened. The woman, however, simply looked both lost and horrified. However, this was short-lived, as no sooner had the pair returned their attention to her Then did they bring their weapons up and dispatch the would-be wizard with extreme prejudice, their high-caliber rifles tearing the body to pieces before sending it slumping lifelessly to the ground. As the robbers ran off, the video burst into a cacophony of screams and terror before cutting out. "That's fucking wild, right?" Hogan said, returning his attention to Supreme. Yeah, that's pretty fucked up," Supreme said, unsure of exactly how to feel. He had seen his fair share of videos online of death, ranging from the simple accidents to executions in war zones. But in this he felt conflicted, feeling almost responsible as it was his own emergence as a hero that had inspired this poor girl to meet her grisly end. The thoughts were compounded over the next 10 minutes as Hogan had Jason pull up other such videos. One was of a man dressed like an animal of some kind. His head was covered in a hood which connected to a long cloak with a skunk-like black and white pattern. It wasn't until a small line of text populated the bottom of the screen, briefly reading, "Honey Badger." Unlike the previous video, this was a collection of CCTV footage in some sprawling metropolitan downtown area. From beneath his badger cloak, Supreme could make out what appeared to be large mitts, upon which were fastened large, curved blades, set as claws atop each of the man's hands. He was running at a full sprint after a pair of men who were themselves running off after snatching a woman's purse. As the Honey Badger man closed with the two fleeing suspects, they turned and confronted him. Though he posed as if he knew martial arts and held out a single curved claw towards them, likely demanding they surrender to him, the two moved in. The first man brought a swift and powerful right hook to the Badger man's hooded face, as the second followed up with an equally crushing series of punches to the side of his head. The Badger went down, and the pair went to work, mercilessly stomping and kicking him, until after a short time he simply stopped moving as blood leaked from his head onto the sidewalk, pooling at their feet. With a final kick to his lifeless head, the pair turned and strolled casually off, seeming to laugh with one another as they did. It was a brutal beating to behold, not remotely exciting nor comical as many an internet ass-whooping video tended to be, but ugly and cruel. "That is fucking wild," Hogan repeated before watching the next video. For the next 20 minutes or so, Supreme watched as one costumed wannabe after another found themselves in situations resulting in beatings, arrests, or gruesome deaths. It wasn't until the fourth or fifth of such video clips that he saw they were all part of a compilation video entitled "Street Hero Fails." After the final clip, in which a man dressed head to toe in American flag patterns was hauled off by police while shouting about truth and justice, the screen finally went dark again. "So, what do you think of that?" Hogan asked, turning back to Supreme. "I think, He thought deeper on the question for a moment. "I think people should leave the superhero stuff to actual superheroes, honestly." "So, you don't condone what these people are doing?" "No, not really. I mean, I can get shot and not die. Most people can't really do that," he replied. Hogan nodded lightly in agreement. "Even leave the house dressed like any of that, let alone go start some shit. That's just stupid, especially if you're untrained. Do you train?" Not really. I guess you wouldn't have to. I do Krav Maga. Ever heard of it?" Supreme shook his head. The conversation then turned to martial arts, a topic Supreme was entirely ignorant to, short of hearing commentary while watching MMA fights on TV. It seemed for a short bit as though Hogan was almost talking to himself as he gushed about his love for the sport. The conversation carried on like this until Supreme was snapped back to attention with a very peculiar question. "So right, now there are a lot of rumors going around about you. Have you heard any of them?" Hogan asked. "Rumors? No. Like what?" "Well, the big one is that you're a Nazi," Hogan replied. "Fuck. Yeah, I've heard that. I'll clear that up right now. I didn't know who those guys were. They just sent me an email, and they were all kinds of nice and talking like they were big fans. I didn't know about the whole Nazi thing. Yeah, Hogan said understandingly. I've had that happen here. You did? Oh, yeah. A guy I had on a show a few months ago, some big online political guy. We had a great chat, and then out of nowhere, he starts talking about different races and how some are better than others, and blah, blah, blah. Oh my god. The media and like every blog on the planet was like, oh my god, Hogan is a Nazi, even though I had no idea what the dude was really about. I won't be bringing him on back again. Supreme nodded along. Yeah, it's the same thing. And also, the thing everyone seems to forget is I laser-eyed them as soon as I found out. Killed a lot of Nazis that day. That's true. That's true, you did. Funny thing though, do you know what another rumor attached to that one is? No, Supreme responded, almost as a question. That you're an agent of the Deep State. Do you know what the Deep State is? No, can't say I do. So, the Deep State is like the shadow government behind the government. It's a super secret cabal that secretly runs the whole world, Hogan said. I'm going on to explain the theory in depth, with most of it flying clear over Supreme's head. In an undisclosed location, miles below the Earth's surface in a large, shadowy command center, the cabal listens in intently. The military brass both glared furiously at CIA, who sat back casually in his seat, feet propped up on the large table around which they all sat. He looked nonplussed and casually lit a cigarette. He said nothing, but merely shrugged at the brass. You think it's cute or something? Are you trying to compromise us? The general growled. Really? CIA replied with a roll of his eyes. The guy talks about deep state this and that on practically every show. Nothing new here, so unbunch your panties. If this is the first time our boy has ever heard of it, then maybe he'll seek us out instead of this other way around the crap you guys have been trying at this whole time. So there are two governments? Supreme asked, his face contorted in the sort of thinking face typically reserved for young children when asked to put on their thinking caps. Yeah, except the one we see is just like a smokescreen, right? They're just like a big carnival sideshow to keep us distracted from what's really going on, Hogan replied. So then what's really going on? That's the thing, man. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. And that's the reason they're so effective at what they do. It's because it's a secret. So secret, no one knows what's even going on. Hogan, eyes wide and excited, nodded along with his own cadence as he spoke, as though agreeing with himself on Supreme's behalf. He considered this, his mind naturally doubling back over and over about the Ouroboros nature to the whole idea. How could you be sure of something if you not being sure of it was the whole point? It was like so many times from his youth when he would bully some puny runt on the playground, and when faced with the demands for an answer as to why by the teacher, he'd look up and defiantly say, because. But now, it didn't make sense. Though he'd continue using because as reason and excuse for all manner of bad behavior well into his 20s, to say that the entire world ran on that very same honestly empty line of bullshit just didn't seem to make any sense at all. He leaned in closer to the microphone. But if, like, they're so good at stuff that literally no one knows what they're doing or who they are or whatever, then, like, how do we know they're, like, real? He said slowly, the basic chain of logic being forged slowly in the dim furnace of his mind, yet with some little kindling beginning to burn just ever so brighter. That's the thing. We can't, because they make it impossible. Hogan tipped back his scotch, smiling, clearly enjoying this exchange. For his part, he could For his part, he could see Supreme's subtle and not so subtle cues, imparting that he had no idea what either of them were talking about. But seeing the gears begin to turn behind the eyes gave him a definite joy in it all. That doesn't make any sense. But so people are saying that I'm part of that? Some people, yeah. Jason, bring that up. Like, yeah. Here's this one dude, goes on Twitter by @reallyyoungcrip. Let's all just accept the fact that Deep State are really unfrozen Nazis, and they've chosen the dumbest chud they could to be their Ubermensch. The original Nazis wore Hugo Boss, so of course the new current year guy wears fucking Supreme gear, the tweet read. Supreme looked curiously at the tweet and account image. It was a bit grainy, despite or perhaps due to being blown up on a large OLED TV at the far end of the room. But regardless, Supreme could see, clear as day, what appeared to be a smirking cripple. Not in the pejorative sense of the word, but one proudly proclaimed both by his t-shirt, which read "Queer, Disabled, Mexican, Get Over It," and his thin, atrophied forearms and wrists, which sat upon a wheelchair, grinning crookedly at the camera. His hands were propped up with chopsticks and duct tape, and middle fingers raised like scarecrows on crossbeam popsicle sticks. Supreme furrowed his brow in frustration. He had gone there to clear his name of being a Nazi, and here he was, what apparently seemed to be a gay Mexican man in a wheelchair, saying he was not only a Nazi, but some sort of thought-out, cryogenically frozen in time shadow government super agent who was also a Nazi. None of this was going to plan. Panic began to set in. But like Hogan said, breaking Supreme's train of thought to his sincere gratitude, this guy is also a comic, a comedian, so this is most likely a joke. He let out a laugh of both mirth and mostly relief. Oh, yeah, okay. But is it a joke? Hogan asked, peering crook-eyed across the table, a freshly lit cigar smoldering between his fingers, a plume of smoke rising into the ceiling. I mean, I don't get it, but yeah? Supreme stuttered in reply. I'm sure it's a joke, Hogan replied quickly. But still, man, some wild shit is going on right now, don't you think? Supreme nodded sincerely. Absolutely. Actually, I was in China recently. You went to China, interrupted Hogan. Yeah, I mentioned that. I flew over to grab some things, and well, there was these factories with these trampolines and nets and shit. Again, Supreme was suddenly cut off as the soft-spoken producer of the show spoke up. It was hard to hear him initially, as he spoke very softly, and the headphones, despite his own super hearing, still worked rather well at dampening noise. But as Hogan leaned towards him and uttered the words, "Throw that shit up," Supreme was able to piece together what he'd heard softly muttered before. "There's another one," Jason had said. And there, on the large screen, another video began playing. In this one, a large, clearly muscular man in a long black leather coat, with gothic makeup on his face, dual-wielding a pair of what looked like double-barreled assault rifles, came into frame. He was firing wildly from the hip, spraying what was a series of clearly run-down row houses somewhere on the East Coast. Those who weren't fleeing the violence had taken cover, with many returning fire with pistols of their own. "Oh, shit. When was this?" Hogan said, turning more towards the screen, eyes fixed on the mayhem that was ensuing. "This is live." "This is live? Like, right now?" a surprised Hogan asked. "This is live," Jason replied. "This is live? Like, right now?" a surprised Hogan asked. "Yeah, live feed from Baltimore as of 18 minutes ago." Hogan looked across to Supreme, who was fixated upon the on-screen violence. He was at that point quite stoned, and feeling a slight yet growing buzz from the multiple scotches he had sipped during the podcast. While far from a stranger to seeing or committing acts of violence himself, it was perhaps this mellowed, mild intoxication that caused him to see the whole scene as revolting. This became compounded when Hogan spoke next. "That is fucked up, huh? Now, what do you think of all these new vigilante people? Like fuckface McMurder Monster there, or that Badger guy. Do you think they're doing good? It's clearly stupid dangerous," Hogan asked. "Well, yeah, it is, I guess. If you don't... I've got superpowers, right? Unless you've got real powers, or a super suit like my buddy Mark, it's kind of stupid to go running around looking for trouble like that. I guess if, their hearts are in the right place, I can't say it's bad, but it's definitely dangerous and definitely really stupid, I guess," Supreme replied slowly. "Do you feel responsible for inspiring them at all?" Supreme wasn't even aware until then that there were costumed people running around pretending to be superheroes, let alone that they were inspired by him. But it made sense once he put it together, and suddenly he felt conflicting emotions. On the one hand, he was not their dad, and whatever stupid decisions they made were on them. He wasn't responsible for the dead magic wand girl or crazy flag man, and especially not for the Hot Topic Punisher knockoff presently shooting up a Baltimore neighborhood on the TV screen. But at the same time, following the logic of his choice to be a superhero at all, further than he had ever thought before, he thought deeper on the idea. He fought and killed bad guys. Why did he do this? The most reasonable answer, it seemed, was to make the world a better place. Okay then, he reasoned. So, have people, if they got these stupid ideas from seeing or hearing about him, gone out and made the world better by getting killed? Having the shit kicked out of them, or whatever the rampage was about? Not really. The implications of this began to sit heavily upon Supreme, and his brow furrowed for the trouble. In some fashion, he was responsible, even though he didn't want to be. And since the bad guys are the ones doing bad things, like the guy on TV, then in this case, he must be a villain. Things, Supreme could see, were getting considerably more complicated than he was comfortable with, and it made his head hurt to think about. "I mean," he began, "I guess? Yeah? Kinda? If that prick there was inspired by me, he's doing it wrong." "What would you tell him if you could talk to him right now?" Hogan asked, a puff of smoke hanging around his head. "Well," Supreme was suddenly struck by an idea just then. He turned to the producer. "This is in Baltimore, you said?" "Yeah, Baltimore. Still a live feed," Jason replied. Supreme looked over to Hogan, took off his headphones. Hogan smiled slightly as he picked up on what Supreme was about to do. "You going after him?" he asked, tapping the ash from his cigar. "Well, actually, yeah. That's not hero shit. That's just a dude shooting up a neighborhood in costume. That's bad guy shit." "That's a fucking bad guy," Supreme replied, the words making more sense as he spoke them aloud. "Well, shit. Okay. I guess that's the end of our conversation then. Thanks for coming in. How long do you think?" Before Hogan could finish, Supreme had bolted from the studio, out of the house and into the sky in a furious blur at speed. Plugging simply Baltimore into his phone, he rocketed upwards to cruising altitude and, placing his earbuds in, shot immediately eastward and then ever so slightly northward, following the direction that came from them. He had never been to Baltimore and knew nothing of what it looked like outside of his time watching The Wire. As he approached the eastern seaboard, making remarkable time as he was then pushing himself with a genuine sense of urgency, he found it overcast, with a low, hazy cloud cover. Dropping down below it, he checked his phone to ensure the smaller city below was the correct one. Confirming this, he flew lower still, removing his earbuds and training his hearing, searching for the sounds of gunfire. There was plenty to be heard, as he found out, as it seemed that throughout great swaths of the city there was gunplay afoot. But straining further, the heavy, concussive thudding of automatic weapons fire with flurries of pistol pops seemed to be coming from the western end of the city. Honing in on this, it took Supreme little time to find the battle zone. It was in what looked like a particularly run-down part of town, with bullet-laden pockmarks along many of the walls that had clearly been put there prior to the current situation. People were running all about down below, as the pops of exchanged gunfire rang out in all directions. A moment later, Supreme zeroed in on the black-clad one-man army and flew down to come standing just before him, hands on hips, looking like a classic comic book hero. It felt a bit goofy, but he did it anyway. The gunman had slung one of his rifles and had taken to aiming more carefully with the other. Its two twin barrels smoked as he held it aloft, pointing it now at the invulnerable superhuman who stood before him. He glared at Supreme through strands of long, scraggly black hair. "Is it true you're bulletproof?" he asked in what was a very intentionally gruff voice. "Yeah, Supreme's reply was cut short, as the gunman immediately fired twice, sending 4 larger rifle bullets hurling harmlessly against his chest. Supreme shot the man an annoyed look of exasperation as he gazed down at the damage to his shirt. "Yes, I'm bulletproof," he growled. "Who the fuck are you supposed to be?" "I'm the Judgment," the man grumbled in a very fake voice, though quite earnest in his sense of pride. "The Judgment?" Supreme replied, his eyebrow cocked in actual judgment. "Yeah, what of it?" Judgment sneered. Supreme just shook his head dismissively. "Nothing. Never mind. So, what are you doing here? And why are you shooting up this neighborhood?" he asked. "Why? Because they're scum. A blight on a once beautiful city," Judgment barked, his voice clearly straining from continuing his facade. "So you're just shooting at them? I don't get it. What does that accomplish?" "You wouldn't understand," Judgment croaked, his voice growing hoarser. "Down here in the streets, we don't have the superpowers or government help." "Whoa. Pump the brakes there, bro. I don't have nothing to do with the government, okay?" "Yeah, sure. Whatever. Fact is, this neighborhood used to be beautiful. Families would be raised and children would play. Now, it's the playground of these thieves and dope fiends, and I've had enough." Judgment was clearly nearing the end of his ability to keep his voice in character, as some of his final words cracked as he spoke them. Supreme looked around the street, the solid walls of dilapidated row houses, all painted seemingly different yet all unanimously faded colors. It looked honestly like shit, and looked as though it had looked like shit for quite some time. He somehow doubted the claim made by the goth kid gun nut who stood before him. This then caused him to ponder a second doubt. "So, are you from here?" Supreme asked, cocking his head to the side. "What difference does that make?" "A lot of difference, dude. So, are you from here?" "No, I'd never lower myself to living in a shithole like this," Judgment spat after a pause. "Then, what the fuck are you, even fucking doing here? This ain't your hood. Why do you give a shit what goes on here? Where are you even from, bruh?" "Doesn't matter." "The fuck it doesn't. Come on, tough guy. Where'd you come from?" Supreme said, his tone growing slightly mocking as he found this wannabe increasingly pathetic with every struggled growl he made. He noticed that once he looked beyond the makeup on the face, he was notably gaunt. Wiry, too, with the bulk mostly coming from his armor. Looking beyond the hair, then, he stifled a chuckle as he noticed this Judgment character had what he laughingly referred to as a tallboy head. Thin and narrow, his head was also tall, like a tallboy beer can. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something familiar about the build, expression, and attitude of the man before him. Judgment sneered again, causing some of his black lipstick he wore to smudge on his teeth. Whatever the scary or intimidating aesthetic he was going for seemed to fall apart the more one looked at him, guns and armor notwithstanding. He glared into Supreme's eyes, beaming hatred as hard as he could, but sadly only looking sillier in the eyes of the super person he was facing off against. He took a slow breath. "I'm from Pennsylvania," he muttered, attempting to sound defiant but coming across as plainly defeated. "Like Philly?" "No, not Philly." "So like some suburb or something?" Supreme asked. "Yeah, something like that. What does it matter?" "It matters because, bro, you rolled up into someone else's hood in a whole different state and just started shooting. Like, what the fuck, you know?" "You just don't get it. It's time people took the country back from the criminal scum from top to bottom. This neighborhood is a notorious gang territory. I've come to clean it up." "So you just randomly start shooting?" "They're all gangbangers. What difference does it make to you? How is this any different than the shit you've done? We're practically the same," Judgment replied. No. We are not the same at all," Supreme replied, pointing up and down the gunman. "I go after bona fide bad guys. Dudes in shootout with police, terrorists, drug cartels. You're just shooting up a shitty city block in a city you don't even live in." "You put cops in the hospital." I was still getting used to shit," Supreme said, suddenly defensive as he realized that cracking a SWAT team member's skull wasn't very hero-y. "You think that just because you have powers it makes you any different than me?" Judgment shouted, his voice the audible equivalent of the experience of strep throat. "Well, yeah, it does. Because you can shoot me in the face and..." Supreme was suddenly stopped mid-sentence as a loud pop, followed by the breezy sensation of a pistol round smashing into his cheek, distracted him. He was honestly surprised for a moment, almost impressed at how fast Judgment had managed to draw and fire his gun. This, though, was replaced quickly by annoyance. Brushing some residue from his face, he continued. "Very funny." Judgment actually smiled at this point, feeling for the moment a bit clever. Supreme sighed. He could already tell how this was all going to go down from here. "Point is that no one can stop me. Not you, nor anyone," he said. "And so, just because you're super powerful, that means you get to call the shots and do whatever you want?" Judgment retorted. "Is it might makes right? Because right now, I'm mightier than these scumbags, and you're in my way." "No, it's that because I have this power, I choose to do good with it. Or, not even. I kind of have a responsibility, like Uncle Ben said." Supreme had never really given this aspect of his hero persona much thought until now. The motivation of it all. Like most men of his age, he'd been raised with the comic books, TV shows, and movies that cause young boys to dream of heroism and the glory that comes with it. Though, even as a fan in his youth, he'd never really focused on anything beyond the action of it all. He never truly wondered why, for instance, Superman decided to be Superman. But he did remember the bit from Spider-Man about great power and all. For the first time in his life, the real meaning behind what he casually dismissed as just some nerd's writing made a different and deeper kind of sense to him.
Don't give me that shit. You're no different than me, except that you can fly and do lasers and deflect bullets, and I have to put real work in to clean up.
A series of coughs caused him to pause. Judgment had finally reached his voice's breaking point. He coughed and grumbled as he attempted to clear his throat, which at that point was on absolute fire as a result of his forced affectation. "You okay there, big guy?" Supreme asked, smirking.
Fuck you, I'm fine.
"Why do you talk like that?"
Talk like what?
The now very hoarse Judgment spat.
Like this,
Supreme said, mimicking Judgment's voice.
I don't sound like that. Yes, you do. No, I don't. Yeah, you do.
"It sounds dumb," Supreme said, still mocking him.
Know what? Fuck you. I've had enough of bullies like you.
Judgment rasped as he reached beneath his trench coat, producing a hand grenade. As he pulled the pin and wound up to throw it, Supreme suddenly realized why he looked familiar. Snapping for a moment in his mind back to high school, he remembered pushing the wiry little goth kids around for kicks between classes. He'd always wondered in the back of his mind if he might inspire a Columbine-style incident, but had never let that stop him, either in his youth or later into his 20s. No sooner had this thought crossed his mind, though, than did Judgment hurl the grenade at him with surprising accuracy. In a different life, under different circumstances, and had he made different choices, he may have made a fantastic baseball pitcher. But these idle what-ifs aside, his throw was as perfect as Supreme's catch, as he effortlessly snatched the small explosive out of the air before him and held it tight in his hand. There was a second or two, perhaps, before the explosion, in which time Supreme afforded Judgment a vicious and knowing sort of smile. Holding the grenade aloft just in front of him, Supreme merely mouthed the word, boom, before the device went off in his hand. A cloud of smoke billowed in all directions around him, obscuring him from view for the hovering news and police helicopters above, the stunned, still watching bystander, and armed locals who watched in awe and, of course, the Judgment. A slight breeze cleared the smoke after a few moments, and there, before him as before, stood Supreme, his hand clenched in an outstretched fist. Turning his hand over so as to be palm down, Supreme looked to his fist and then back to Judgment before opening his fingers. From his hand fell a clinking shower of small metal fragments, all clicking and scattering on the pavement at his feet. He smiled broadly, his next words excitedly stepping out from his mental bullpen. "It's over, Judgment. Surrender," he said. They were classic superhero lines, and here, for the first time, confronted with what he could regard as an actual villain, he felt so very righteous in the delivery of his lines. Looking first to Supreme, Judgment's gaze shot quickly to the left, looking over his shoulder at the stunned and armed onlookers he had previously been engaging. He mirrored Supreme's smile, though doing such with an ugly and sinister affectation. His hand reached again into his coat.
You might be bomb-proof, you fucking chud, but I can tell you this. They aren't,
he said, and upon his last utterance, drew from his coat a grenade, the pin already pulled out by his thumb, and he wound back, ready to lob it towards his targets. Supreme rushed him then, darting forward at an impossible speed, then grabbing Judgment's bomb hand and pulling it towards him. Bringing his arm evenly between them, Supreme then brought his other hand up and cupped Judgment's grenade and the hand that sought to throw it into an iron-cupped grip. Judgment's eyes widened as the implications of this move settled into his mind in the brief moments before the explosion. Supreme merely smirked. A second later, a loud but muffled boom let out from beneath Supreme's clasped fingers. So tight was his grip that nearly every ounce of energy released by the grenade's explosion was kept secured within his hands, reducing judgments to nothing more than a charred and visceral mess of scorched flesh and an agonizing stump of a wrist. He pulled back what used to be his hand, but wasting no time, drew with his still working left hand a large pistol, which he attempted to bring up to Supreme's head. Supreme merely gripped his gun hand and squeezed, pulping the flesh and bone and mashing it into the condensing polymer grip of the pistol. As he squeezed, Judgment squealed, though not in his wannabe gruffness, but in a higher, more nasal tone. "Ah!" he cried. "Ah, there's the real voice," Supreme said with a chuckle, before releasing both of his hands and allowing him to step backwards, staring now at both of his hopelessly mangled appendages. Judgment howled in pain once again, before being overtaken by a truly senseless rage. Screaming in fury and agony, he wound up and delivered a roundhouse kick to Supreme's upper leg. However, the desired effect was not found, as instead Judgment's right calf bone shattered into countless pieces like glass. He crumpled to the ground, screaming in even further agony. "Like I said, it's over. Don't make this worse than it has to be, bruh," Supreme said. As he spoke, Judgment began crawling backward upon his elbows, propelling himself with his one remaining good leg. His right hand was entirely gone, replaced with a charred and still smoking stump. His left hand was a contorted mess of bloody flesh and bone fragments poking out from all angles. "Not over," he replied, as with the two fingers which somehow miraculously still worked upon his left hand, he pulled from beneath his coat a detonator button. As he smiled wickedly, the sweat causing his black and white makeup to run down his face, he pressed down on the big red button atop the handle with his still functioning pinky finger. Along his chest, lights began to flash. Supreme hadn't noticed it before, but his body armor looked strange, as it was segmented into rectangular bricks along his vest. As the lights flashed, the connection between the smile, the button, and the rectangles all suddenly made sense to him, and the danger to the immediate area became apparent. He knew what he had to do. Dashing over to the would-be suicide golf bomber, Supreme gripped the stiff nylon shoulder strap of Judgment's vest and, with a single whirl, threw him high into the air. In the last split second before hurling him into the sky, Supreme measured his force in a last-minute calculation, ensuring that the human bomb exploded well below the hovering helicopters above. He shot up into the air. A moment later, Judgment exploded with what to those standing below was a deafening crack and kaboom. As he watched Judgment explode, part of him was kind of surprised there was less a fireball and more a sudden violent poofing of what looked like dust, red mist, and unidentifiable bits of various tissue. Looking about, he saw the entire neighborhood of people, some with guns in hand, others hiding behind building corners, cars, or in windowsills, all staring at him in amazement and disbelief. Looking around, the silence was deafening, until a single clap began coming from down the street. This was soon joined by others, and before long, the entire block seemed to be cheering, hooting and whooping for him, as thanks for having saved them from such terror. Supreme smiled, basking in the kind of adoration he had always dreamed of since becoming a hero. He raised his arms to his side and grinned in triumph as the applause continued. And then, quite suddenly, it started to rain. But it was not the ordinary rain one might expect from such an overcast day, but instead it was at first a light trickle of red mist. This was followed almost as soon as everyone had noticed by a growing downpour of blood and slapping bits of charred viscera crashing to the pavement like bits of overdone steak. As it turned out, many a chunk of human flesh had been launched into the propeller blades of the flying choppers above, pureeing them somewhat before letting them fall back to earth. No sooner had the realization of this settled into everyone's mind than did additional wet, small chunks of meat, some charred, some still wet and sloppy, continued falling equally upon the street and standers-by alike for 5 or 10 seconds. The viscera and gore of the scene turned what had looked like a war-torn slum into a scene straight from a horror film. The applause naturally died down as the sudden squall of gore-strewn weather fell and then ceased, leaving a greater part of the street and those still in it painted with red blood. But the spray and dropping bits of people meat were not the end. As soon the downward force of the helicopter's wash continued the dust and ash of the exploded person to begin coming down like snowfall, sticking instantly to whatever blood-soaked surface it landed upon, be those houses, cars, or people. All fell silent as the revolting nature to the sudden change in localized climate became apparent. The silence seemed to drag on for ages, though it was quickly interrupted by the sound of police sirens arriving entirely too late on the scene, as was standard in the city. Screeching to a halt, several police leapt from their cruisers, weapons trained on Supreme, as well as numerous locals who stood armed in the open. Many of the civilians, both armed and unarmed, fled.
Supreme, this is the Baltimore Police. Put up your hands and turn to face me,
one officer shouted over the cruiser's PA system. Supreme cocked his head to the side, remembering his previous overzealous interactions with police back in Boston. Not wishing to repeat this, he turned and faced the police, who were now being lightly caked in human ash as they kept their weapons trained upon him, though he did not raise his hands as ordered.
Are you serious? Did you not just see what happened?
He asked.
Yo, for real, why don't you save the whole hood?
A young man who had come out of cover, his face and shoulders, though still covered in blood and ash.
Put your hands in the air now!
The officer barked, ignoring the protest.
You know guns don't work on me, right? I just kind of had this conversation with... Well, he's kind of exploded now, but the point is you're wasting your time,
Supreme replied, his right eyebrow raised quizzically. A couple of the officers looked to one another, recognizing the truth of his statement. However, the one with the microphone, presumably the head officer in charge, dismissed this out of hand. Looking about and noticing that a couple of his backup officers seemed to be lowering their weapons, he barked further commands to them.
"Keep your weapons on the suspect!"
he shouted. And though they complied, it was clear they were not exactly thrilled to do so.
Listen, I'm gonna take off now, okay? You guys have a great day, or something, Supreme said, before reaching into his pocket for his phone. This was a momentary lapse in thinking, as it was after a volley of pistol fire was sent hurtling at him from the very nervous police. He had forgotten that they tended not to like it, who suddenly reached into a pocket for something when they had their own guns out. Looking down, he was at least pleased to notice that his phone remained still miraculously undamaged. Holding the phone aloft, after the short-lived salvo died out, he furrowed his brow in annoyance. It's my phone! Jesus, fucking relax, guys,
he told them, as several of the officers, now seeing the impotency of their sidearms and the obvious reality that he didn't intend on fighting them, lowered their weapons once again.
You will place the phone on the ground, get down on your knees, and...
The officer on the microphone, though not accustomed to being disobeyed so casually, stopped mid-sentence as Supreme held up his index finger and made a quiet hush sound. His finger still held up at them, as one might a child or babbling drunk. Supreme quickly sent a text from his phone before putting it back in his pocket. It was an unresolved matter, upon which he still had questions, and wanted to make sure he sent his message before it slipped his mind, as things were often ought to do. Once finished, He slid the phone back into his pocket and lowered his head. "Officers," he began, dropping half an octave with his voice in an attempt to exude a more heroic tone. "My work is done, but you keep on doing a great job. Yeah." It was at that moment that he rather wished he'd figured out a proper catchphrase. Something like up and away, but less lame. The absence of such lent itself to an awkward silence, as though all in attendance were waiting for something more. "So, okay. Bye," Supreme said, then kicking off up into the air, above the helicopters, and then up into the still low-hanging ceiling of cloud cover. From there, he rose above them still, placed his earbuds in his ears, activated his phone's GPS navigation, and then shot off at speed, back towards the warehouse of solitude. His flight took but a mere 20 minutes, and as he came to a landing just inside the large open space before his makeshift living room, he glanced briefly at the pressure washer and remembered he'd need to shower a good bit of vigilante off of him. Mark rose from the couch, where he had, with a good deal of groaning and aching, repositioned from laying down to sitting up. As he hobbled his metal frame over toward Supreme, he raised a fist for a hello fist bump. Supreme responded in kind. "Saw the whole Baltimore thing go down. Nice work. Well, for a second, I thought you were gonna start killing the bangers and corner boys alongside that death metal guy," Mark said, looking at Supreme's again blood-soaked and bullet-riddled outfit. "Nah, that guy was a straight-up psycho and all. Because they're poor and got guns doesn't mean they're gangbangers, right?" Supreme replied, strolling over to the rack of fresh, still-wrapped clothing. "In Baltimore? Still, seems like you won some good graces online," said Mark. "Really?" asked Supreme, pulling off the blood-soaked rags that were just a few hours ago pristine. "Yeah, a bunch of bloggers and vloggers and whatever they're called, influencers. A lot of them are posting this and that like a redemption arc for you." "A what?" Supreme asked. "A redemption arc. Like when a bad guy turns into a good guy." "Oh, well, like Vader in Star Wars." Mark cocked his head slightly to the side. "Not exactly the example I'd have picked, but yeah, like that. Yeah, except before the very end. And I've still got both of my hands." Before peeling off the shredded sweatpants he wore, he pulled his phone from his pocket after feeling it vibrate. A text message had arrived, a response to that he'd sent before taking off. "What's up with that?" Mark asked. "Just a clue to a little mystery I learned about," Supreme said, tossing his phone down onto his easy chair. "Ever heard of the Deep State?" Mark's pulse quickened just a little at the mention of it. He knew about it in concept and what the conspiracy theories about it were, but was also acutely aware that he had been freed from prison and put into this supersuit by what was very likely part of that big spooky cabal behind the scenes. This, he reasoned, probably was not a helpful thing to disclose given Supreme's newfound interest. No, I haven't. What is it?" Never mind for now. Hey, do you mind using that sprayer to help hose me off? That judgment guy's starting to stink on me," replied Supreme. "Sure, yeah, let's get you hosed down," Mark replied, and the two made their way out into the yard beyond where the commandeered vat and pressure washer sat. On the easy chair, Supreme's phone remained on and active for another few moments before going black. On the screen was a text exchange between he and Hogan. The first outgoing message was asking for the name and information on the young Crip who had tweeted about him. Supreme reasoned, perhaps, he might know something about the whole deep state thing, and likewise wished to confront him about his Nazi comments. Hogan then replied, first by thanking him for being a guest on his podcast and insisting that he visit Dallas again soon so the two could attend a robot fighting championship. Next, he happily provided a link to Crip's social media, adding that he bet Supreme would find the disabled comedian's material, quote, funny as fuck. As the screen died, a slight yelp came from the yard as the icy cold water blasted upon Supreme's mostly naked body. Though he was immune to cold and heat, the feeling was nevertheless a bit of a shock to the system. Mark couldn't help but chuckle. Chapter 6. Barking Up. Chicago was another place of note which Supreme had never been to before. Once again, not for lack of interest, as he had heard that hot dogs were to Chicago what pizza is to New York, or drunken fistfights over baseball scores were to Boston. In short, what the city was famous for. And as a regular consumer of questionable garbage food items, the origins of which are typically best left disregarded, Supreme felt trying out a proper Chicago dog would be a pleasant bonus for him in the course of carrying out his new mission. Despite him being but a mere comedian, this Crip character had caught Supreme's attention. Not the greatest of detectives, he had decided perhaps this wheelchair-bound trash talker might at least help point him in the right direction in his newfound quest to uncover the deep state. Additionally, though an utterly pointless thing to remark upon or care about, he felt somewhat resentful over being the butt of a joke which both readdressed the Nazi accusations, while also making fun of the style of which he was increasingly uncertain over. As such, after a cursory check through social media, it took only a few minutes for Supreme to find an ad for an upcoming stand-up comedy show where this Crip, who he soon learned was named Donovan, would be opening for another comic at some downtown theater. Tickets had already been sold out, but not one for stand-up beyond that of one act he caught involving puppets. Supreme was not bothered by this. It shouldn't prove to be too difficult, at least, to confront him after the show. He had thought of creating a grand spectacle by entering through perhaps the roof and flying in to confront him publicly in the middle of his performance, but then realized that in all likelihood he would only end up crushing or injuring people in the crowd with the falling debris he created, and likely wouldn't get as warm a reception as he'd like were he to interrupt a show people had paid to see. As he flew towards the windy city, such thoughts mulling in his mind and a whole host of imagined conversations and confrontations playing out in his imagination, he felt a moment of pride, realizing such was further evidence of his growing, albeit still stunted overall maturity. This moment passed, however, as he came to land in the alleyway behind the theater. It looked straight out of a movie to him. The backstage door. The place that rock stars and celebrities would shuffle out to avoid paparazzi and crushing waves of fans. It was empty, but not without a charm. Using his enhanced hearing, Supreme managed to tune his ears into the show going on inside. He could hear the very clear and very identifiable voice of Crip, who seemed to be finishing a joke.
See, I don't judge all of these superheroes the same. I'm in a fucking wheelchair, so I really can't. Supreme, I think the only thing that guy and I have in common is how often dumbasses on Twitter call us a Nazi. Me because I make fun of those people, and him because he hangs out at Nazi rallies. Aside from just that one thing, though, fuck that guy. It's not even that he might be a Nazi, it's that he's the worst thing to fly out of Boston since American Airlines on 9/11.
A clearly strained hush fell over the half of the crowd which didn't laugh. Crip continued.
What? I'm sorry. I didn't know this was a family reunion for Pete Davidson. Maybe he should be a superhero. Makes as much sense as Supreme. He dresses like a hype-beast clown from 2016.
Crip said, pausing for laughter, which, as it rose, made Supreme squirm.
He's not remotely funny. But he still got on Hogan before I did, and let's be honest, what the fuck is he doing with that robot guy? Is he like so powerful he can't fuck a normal sex bot like the rest of us?
Crip paused again, grinning.
See, now you're wondering just how much you have in common with Pete Davidson and completely forgot about Supreme, didn't you?
At that, even Supreme found himself chuckling a bit, as he had to admit it was kinda funny. Crip continued.
I guess in the end, I can at least be happy that most of those other dipshits who went out to fight crime are now more like me than him. Broken ass bodies, lifetime in a wheelchair, and not a single one of them is likely ever going to fuck again. So I guess even if they didn't uphold the law, there's some kind of justice there.
He paused once more for laughter before finishing by introducing the headliner.
Well, shit. You guys have been great. That's my time. Have a great night.
The crowd cheered wildly, and once again. This time, for an extended period, as Crip presumably was wheeled off stage, while the main comic of the night took the microphone. Supreme had, for some reason, assumed Crip would immediately exit the building once his set was over, but instead, it was clear he was hanging around for the duration of the show. He didn't mind waiting, however, as though unfamiliar with the main act, whose name he'd already forgotten. He found the raunchy, vulgar, but undeniably honest routine he eavesdropped on hilarious. An opening set consisting of nearly 15 minutes about dead children and how stupid buying graveyard real estate was, followed by stories of what ordinary people would call embarrassing sexual encounters from his past, the idiocy of politics, and a host of other hilarious points of view Supreme had never considered. He was actually surprised by how short the time seemed to fly by, at least while listening in on the show, all the while keeping his eyes peeled at the metal doorway. While he could very easily pull the doors clean off their hinges, let alone just open, he was slowly learning to avoid needless spectacle. After some half hour or so, during which time, as he leaned in and listened closer, he could hear not only the audience shuffling out of the theater, but the chatter backstage between the comics. A short, yellow school bus, the word school painted over, pulled up in the alley. No sooner had it done so than did the metal double doors to the theater swing open, allowing a large plume of marijuana smoke to escape. It added a bit of extra dramatic flair to what came next, as sitting within his motorized power wheelchair, Crip emerged. His eyes were bloodshot as Hogan's had been before, and across his face, a bent and crooked smile went from ear to ear. It was not bent or crooked merely in the aesthetic sense, though it was a bit uneven, but more it conveyed a genuine joy at having once again gotten away scot-free with telling what polite society would regard as terribly controversial, if not downright offensive jokes. Supreme had to give it to him, though, as the short bit of his set that he'd heard upon arrival was pretty funny at spots. Crip began rolling towards the bus, where the driver, presumably his mother, had begun lowering the wheelchair lift. Before reaching it, though, he stopped abruptly and spun about to face Supreme. He wore a bright pink t-shirt which read, "Queer and Disabled," and looking upon Supreme, raised an eyebrow.
No fucking way, he said with a chuckle. Are you actually him?
Supreme stood tall and answered. Yeah, the one and only, he answered with the same false bravado he typically spoke with when in character.
Bullshit,
Crip replied with a laugh. No, I really am me. I am Supreme, Supreme replied, taken aback just a bit.
Mom, Bring me a spliff, would you?
Crip shouted over his shoulder to the bus driver, who stood just at the end of the lift.
Do you want your Hunter Thompson cigarette holder thing?
She replied, half stepping back into the bus.
You bet your ass I do.
Crip answered, returning his gaze to Supreme.
How about you prove it then?
He said to the confused superhero. A moment later, she emerged from the short bus carrying an unlit joint and an old-timey cigarette holder. Approaching Crip, she nodded at Supreme, slightly confused at the sight of him, and placing the holder into her son's mouth, went to light it before Crip shook his head. Through the gritted teeth which held the cigarette holder in his mouth, he continued.
Think you can light this thing with your laser eyes?
He challenged. Supreme paused, but then nodded. Yeah, I can do that. Then squinting his eyes and focusing carefully, Supreme let a thin beam of energy shoot from his eyes to the rolled paper joint. However, rather than merely lighting a tip, Supreme quite purposely burned the entire thing to ash. Crip shot him a sideways look and spat the holder out onto the concrete below.
Well, that was a dick move,
he said snidely. No, you know what's a dick move? Telling people I'm some fucking secret government Nazi when I'm not! Supreme spat back.
What? I didn't say you were a Nazi. The fuck is this?
Yeah, you did. On Twitter. Josh Hogan showed me.
Wait, that tweet? I wasn't saying you were a Nazi. I was saying you dressed like a 2018 hype beast date rapist.
Crip replied, with all of the indignity of a man wronged. The reference flew somewhat over Supreme's head, aside from the understanding that he was again making fun of his outfit. A lot of people seemed to be doing that, he had noticed. He never quite understood why, as to him, such expensive gear was still the height of men's fashion. The fuck is that supposed to mean? He asked defensively.
That you look like a kind of guy who thinks TGI Fridays is fine dining?
What? Supreme was getting more lost and more annoyed by the second.
You look like the sort of guy who considers half a can of Axe and a breath mint to be a shower.
Alright, listen, you little shit, Supreme shouted, now well beyond both confused and pissed.
Oh my fucking god! You're a superhero who flies across the country to pick on a crippled comedian. This is fucking hilarious,
Crip said, bursting out in open laughter. This caused Supreme to pause a moment. He hadn't planned on hurting Crip. In truth, he hadn't planned anything, short of asking him what the deep state was and how to find them. Though he could have easily Googled the question, or even asked Hogan, who was apparently quite the enthusiast in regards to the theory. Neither had crossed his mind, as the mix of insult and interference was enough to set his sights on Crip, even though he had no idea what he'd do once he found him. You know what? Fuck it, never mind, Supreme muttered, somewhat defeated, turned and began to walk off. Crip's chuckle continued, but abated slightly as he saw the butt of his joke turn his back, seemingly to sulk slightly.
Wait a second, you didn't seriously fly all the way here just to say you're not a Nazi, did you?
Supreme stopped in his tracks. No, not just that, he said over his shoulder.
So what is it then?
Crip asked, now genuinely curious as to why this international menace had thought to seek him out. Supreme turned around once again. Well, what do you know about the dark state? He asked, almost timidly, not wishing to sound any dumber than he already felt.
Do you mean the deep state?
Crip asked in return, now genuinely curious, and smelling the beginning of a fantastic bit. Yeah, that's it. People have been saying I'm part of it, whatever it is.
And you thought a crippled comedian from Chicago was the guy to ask about it?
Crip said, more as a statement than a question, cutting Supreme off midway. You know, when you put it like that, it does sound pretty stupid. Never mind, Crip cut him off again, not wishing to lose such a golden opportunity.
No, it's fine. You found the right guy. What is it you want to know?
Well, for starters, what is it? I know it's some secret government thing, but what is it, and why do people think I'm a part of it? Crip struggled desperately to contain the dastardly smirk that wanted so desperately to cross his face. Composing himself, he looked Supreme dead in the eye before speaking.
It is. It's a secret government thing. It's a government behind the government. They're pretty much the ones responsible for every bad thing that happens,
he explained, working extra to suppress a giggle as he knew absolutely nothing about the deep state theory beyond what sounded funny online, but was at the same time very good at making shit up as he went along.
But why? Because they can, dude. Because they can.
Supreme thought on this for a moment. Initially, the idea of being a destructive force unleashing hell across the globe just because seemed absurd to him. That was until, however, another pesky glimmer of self-awareness washed over him. Suddenly, everything made a dark and disturbing kind of sense. Crip, on the other hand, was scrunching his brow as he watched this very simple mind roll the very simple concept presented to it around over and over again. The brow scrunching, however, was less understanding and more an attempt to look sympathetic and understanding as the corner of his lips curled upwards into a grin he could no longer suppress. It was all just too damn funny. Could you tell me more about these guys? Like, who they are, how to find them? Supreme asked.
Absolutely,
Crip said. Suddenly the dam burst, and his laughter cascaded throughout the alleyway. Had he the physical ability to do so, he'd have probably doubled over in laughter. Instead, tears of mirth flowed freely from his eyes as his cackle continued. Supreme looked dubiously at him, before he realized his mistake and regained his composure.
Sorry,
Crip wheezed.
I'm sorry. It's just...
He thought quickly, knowing there were few options to cover his laughter with.
It's just... I've been waiting for someone like you to help me take them down for a long time. And now, here we are.
This was going to be comedy gold. He was certain of it. The troll of all trolls, and the story of all stories. So, what are you suggesting? Supreme asked, his interest piquing.
Okay, a couple questions in mind first. For starters, is there food at your secret hideout?
Supreme shrugged. A bit. I mean, if I need anything, I just go get it.
Good. Second, is there Wi-Fi?
Supreme nodded. Surprisingly enough, yeah, there's 5G up there.
Good enough. Third, do you have any weed, or do I need to bring my own?
Supreme paused. Wait, so...
Listen, big guy. If we're gonna take down these fuckers, I'm gonna need you to bring me into your inner circle. You have an inner circle?
Well, there's me, and there's Mark. He's the mechanoid guy.
Mark the Mechanoid? Is that like his actual hero name?
Crip asked, stifling yet another laugh. Supreme chuckled. It is since I decided it was. Crip let a snigger escape him.
Okay then. Well then I'm going to need to join the team. It'll be like an utterly able three-way between us.
So should we call you? Crip cut him off once more.
Don't you even fucking say it.
Really? Come on.
No.
I'm Supreme. He's Mark the Mechanoid.
And you're...
Crip shot him a look of pure venom. Supreme continued.
Wheels! Fuck no!
Crip exclaimed.
Come on! Listen. Do you want to take down the secret shadow government or not? Because if you do not fucking call me that. Not because it's offensive. Because it's fucking retarded.
Isn't the word retarded offensive now or something? Supreme asked.
Not as offensive as calling a guy in a fucking wheelchair wheels. I'm disabled. That's retarded. Are you fucking retarded?
No, Supreme replied defensively.
Good. Now we have that in common at least.
The two stared at one another, as though in the most awkward and impossible standoff in history. Both were sizing each other up, Supreme wondering just what secrets the little man in the wheelchair might know. Crip wondering just how far he could take this bit, and whether the dopey-looking super-powered hype beast before him would ever catch on or get it at all. Then Crip turned his head to shout over his shoulder once more.
Hey, Mom!
Crip hollered over his head. Yeah, honey? His mother/driver/manager replied, poking her head out from the open passenger door.
Grab my overnight bag. And my weed.
You have, like, a face mask or anything? Goggles or the like? Supreme asked.
Why?
It gets a little windy. Soon, Crip was soaring into the air. The closest thing he had to a mask was a thin plastic face shield, the type usually used by surgeons and dentists. As Supreme effortlessly lifted the heavy power chair into the air, Crip looked down in wonder at the sight of his mother, his bus, the alley, and the theater, as they all shrank away with the altitude. He, like most people, had never experienced such a flight, and always wanted to find the irony in things. Giggled a bit to himself as he considered that, though he had never walked, nor would ever walk, he, unlike most perfectly able-bodied people, was now flying in a way wholly unnatural to human beings. The joy increased as they began taking off, flying higher, and out over the city of Chicago, presumably east from Crip's best guess and estimate. He wished then he could spread his arms as they soared further upwards and outwards, the notion quickly being made a joke, as similar scenes from the movie Titanic immediately made comparisons within his mind. However, as they picked up speed, the thrill of flight gradually gave way to the harsher physical realities of flying closer and closer to commercial airline speeds without the benefit of a climate-controlled metal shell. The wind speed, that seemed to grow exponentially in strength as they picked up speed themselves, soon began chilling him to the bone. The plastic face shield, while keeping the strong winds from truly battering his face, still managed to curl around the sides of the thin plastic sheet and shoot straight down the back of his shirt, freezing his torso from within. He silently thanked his legs and lower body for being unable to feel anything as the whipping cold grew more and more intense. Without any way to signal Supreme, given the roar of the air whipping around him, he resigned himself then to simply suffering or dying as a result of their trip. Crip was no stranger to death, as such had stalked him relentlessly since birth. Though he'd rather continue on defying the odds, as he had thus far, he did think it would be rather funny if the world's strongest Superman inadvertently killed a disabled person and beaten all other odds, adding to his infamy while letting Crip effectively be and have the last laugh. However, despite the brutal cold and immense discomfort, they eventually came to land outside of a dilapidated warehouse deep in the forest in what Crip was sure was the township of literally fucking nowhere. "Welcome to my lair," Supreme said as the pair touched down.
It's...
Crip began. "Dope, right?"
It's a dump.
Crip finished after a moment's hesitation. Supreme furrowed his brow, slightly offended, slightly confused. "But you haven't seen the inside yet," he argued, stepping toward the large bay door and gesturing for Crip to follow. Crip pressed forward on the control stick of his power chair and felt the machine lurch and wobble along the uneven ground of packed dirt and fallen forest debris. Slowly, he made his way over to the large bay door, at one point dreadfully certain he was about to tip and topple over. It was his first time properly off-roading with his chair, and for what little experience he gained with it, determined in short order that he did not care for it. Once inside, he glanced around the large cavernous space. A living room set of sorts was set up a few yards from the door in an odd configuration that looked to him like some lost and wayward IKEA display that had somehow wandered off from the megastore. Upon the couch sat a man in a metal suit who seemed to sort of teeter in his seat. This was undoubtedly Mark the Mechanoid. "That's Mark," Supreme said as he strolled towards the furniture.
Yeah, I kinda figured that,
Crip replied. This seemed to draw Mark out of whatever stupor he may have been in, as the helmeted head swiveled to meet his gaze. He rose up from his seat, staggering a little bit, looking almost drunk as he did so. He offered a little wave and spoke in a strange, modulated tone. "Hey, how's it going?" he said with a slight nod of his helmet.
Not bad. I'm Donovan,"
Crip replied. "Mark, this is Crip. He's that comedian who knows about the deep state," Supreme explained, excitedly.
Well,
Crip began. But seeing the strange, excited, and almost wild light in Supreme's eyes, decided not to clarify any further.
Yeah, it's me. I'm Crip, I guess.
Hidden behind his face shield and mask, Mark's eyes widened a bit for a moment in fear. Had they sent an agent to find or collect him? This, of course, was idiotic, as why would a secret government agency send a wheelchair-bound comedian online shitposter as an agent? Were his mind not as addled by narcotic hangovers, hunger, thirst, and all-around agony as it was, he'd have likely realized this in much shorter order. Crip's confused and rather telling expression said enough. Mark shuffled over toward the power chair, extending his metal-sheathed hand for a handshake. Crip looked sarcastically at the gauntlet before him before raising his own thin and slightly atrophied hand and accepting the gesture. Behind the mask, Mark raised an eyebrow, thinking to himself that at this rate the warehouse would likely be filled with stray freaks and weirdos, collected like pets by the indestructible moron who was their host. "So you'll be staying with us a while then?" he asked, taking a pull from his water hose.
I guess. For a bit at least,
Crip replied, for the first time genuinely unsure of just what he'd gotten himself into. "Well, there's TV, weed, and I think Supreme's got some booze around here somewhere, if you drink," he said, before turning back towards the couch. "Excuse me, my head is spinning a little bit. Been a big few days, and I kinda need to sit down." Crip glanced down at his chair.
Yeah, I know the feeling,
he joked crassly as Mark returned to his seat. Supreme eagerly then led him about the living space, showing him the cooler in which some random food and drinks were kept, the snack bar, which was loaded with chips and other assorted junk food, the rack of his uniforms, finally, then coming to the arcade motion ride, the prize of his collection. "Feel free to play this whenever," he said with a smile. Crip again looked down at his chair and then to his disused pencil-thin legs.
Thanks. I'll make sure to just jump on that if I feel like it. So, you two live here?
"I do. Mark's just kind of visiting," Supreme replied. "Extended stay, you might say," Mark added.
Are you building some sort of super team or something?
Crip asked. Supreme looked over to Mark and then back to Crip, his eyebrow raised as though the idea was a novel one. He thought about it for a moment. If Crip proved to have some sort of unique gift or helpful attribute, the trio of them would be like something straight from a TV show. "Well," Supreme began, trailing off as he thought. "No," Mark interjected. "Though we did team up to fuck up some narcos. That was fun." Supreme seemingly ignored this comment. "Well, I'm like a Superman. He's like an Iron Man. Supreme, Mark the Mechanoid, and..." Crip already saw where this was going.
No, don't fucking say it.
"And Wheels," Supreme said, completing his thought, much to his own joy and amusement.
Fuck it. Nope. Call me Crip all you like, just not fucking Wheels. God damn it.
"Too late. Once he comes up with a nickname, he never stops," Mark said with a weak chuckle. "Nah, okay, fine. You're Crip," Supreme said, relenting. "Edison, what the fuck?" Mark protested. "Come on, Mechanoid. Dude's in a wheelchair. Least we can do is let him pick his own team name. And remember, it's Supreme. So, this is a fucking team now. I'm in a perpetual hangover from hell. He's about as spry as Stephen Hawking, and you're calling us a super team now. Mark failed to realize that Supreme actually had no idea who Stephen Hawking was. If he knows anything about the deep state or more stuff about Nazis, he can be like our guy in the chair, Supreme said, still beaming with excitement at the new idea. His mind was very much like that of a child in this way, in that once something excited him, it was often difficult, if not impossible, to get him to rethink it until it resulted in disaster. I mean, they seem like the real bad guys these days, right? Secret shadow government and actual Nazis. Mark shook his head and sulked slightly. Oh, please, no. No. Can't we just go kill some more drug cartels or something? They're bad guys and we know how to find them. We can kill cartel guys anytime. If we can manage to take down secret government Nazis, we'll literally be saving the world, Supreme replied eagerly.
So, you think the deep state shadow government are also Nazis?
Crip asked, equally confused and bemused by this somewhat inexplicable link Supreme had made in his mind at some point. Well, aren't they?
It would be kind of hard to know since they're secret, right? They could be furries for all we know,
Crip replied, deciding that there was no sense in not taking this very broken logic to its furthest extent. What are furries? Supreme asked. Never mind, Donovan, do not answer that, Mark said sternly, not wishing his idiot friend to fall down yet another stupid rabbit hole. No, wait. What are furries? Supreme asked again, now genuinely curious. God damn it, Mark muttered to himself as Crip cracked a wicked grin.
So, it starts with an idea and a suit.
Nearly an hour had passed, with Crip needlessly informing Supreme of every trope and detail he could think of regarding the furry community. Supreme was a mix of amused, confused, and disgusted, as the comedian casually described what he imagined the smell of a furry convention might be like. The notion of mostly grown adults spending an entire day in heavy, full-body costumes almost caused Supreme to feel a bit queasy as he compared the scent to a poorly ventilated gym he had once worked out at, only brought to the extreme. Crip spared no detail, either real or made up, and Mark merely groaned and rolled his eyes within his helmet, too physically weak to really interrupt effectively, and too mentally tired to bother trying.
And that's what yiffing is,
Crip said, completing his entirely unnecessary lecture. Supreme's face was contorted in a confluence of revulsion and disbelief. And they do this on the weekends and for events? He asked, astonished that such an odd subculture could even exist.
Some do it kind of full-time,
Crip replied, knowing that this was most likely a lie, as it was improbable to assume many, if any, suited up every day. He gestured to Mark, who at this point was laid out upon the sofa once again, groaning softly out of hunger pains and a swelling migraine.
Take Mechboy here. If cyborgs were an animal that could fuck, he'd be considered a furry.
Fuck you, Wheels. I may be a guy in a suit, but you're more cyborg than I am with that Geo-Metro body brace you cruise around in, Mark spat.
See? They also get really defensive when you make a joke about their persona, Crip added.
Supreme contemplated all he had just been told. Never really one for the internet outside of the occasional creepypasta, viral videos of girls twerking in the classic epic fail compilations. The existence of such a community confounded and confused him. Likewise, being far from what might be described as an enlightened or considerate thinker, it took a significant amount of mental energy to embrace the live and let live perspective he'd been trying to foster on a hobby that affected him in no way other than confusion and a slight tinge of personal distaste. That's That's kind of fucked up, Supreme stammered, unsure of why he'd inquired further in the first place and somewhat regretting his decision.
You know,
Crip continued, even though no one else in the room wanted him to.
some people believe that furries may have ancient Sasquatch DNA,
He lied. What the fuck are you talking about? Mark croaked. Yeah, what do you mean? Supreme added, his confusion now deepening even further.
Well, you know how white people have between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA?
Asked Crip, setting himself up for the avalanche of bullshit that was to follow. They do? Supreme asked.
You do. I'm Mexican.
You are?
Well, half.
Crip admitted with a shrug.
All the same, white people have that old caveman juju flowing through. I wonder if maybe furries aren't the result of some bored caveman who decided to fuck a Sasquatch or something.
Yeah, well, that only tracks if Sasquatches were real. Mark replied with a groan.
The fuck they aren't. Listen, my cousin Pedro
Crip had no cousin Pedro.
was hiking in the mountains in Canada once, and he swears he saw one of the Bigfoot motherfuckers just strolling around like he owned the place. Said he was 9 feet tall, built like a pro wrestler.
And likewise, none of that was true. No shit. So, he, really saw one? Supreme asked, his attention now rapt, as his short attention span was as eager as he was to move on from the previous conversation.
Oh yeah, tried to get a picture, but the big fucker just ran off into the woods. Bullshit,
Mark retorted.
It's true. What, do you think I'm lying?
Crip asked. I know you're lying. It's all bullshit.
Is it because I'm Mexican?
Crip replied, fighting the urge to smirk and chuckle once again.
What? Fucking... No! No, it's that...
Mark stammered.
Listen, if you've got some hang-ups about brown people, the worst thing you can do is, with your racism, is deny it. Not to me. I'm not even judging. But to yourself. I'm not racist!
Mark replied, clearly frustrated, as intended.
I'm not saying you are. I'm just saying maybe you have some latent beliefs or ideas you haven't come to terms with. Admitting it is the first step to addressing it. I'm not a fucking racist!
Mark repeated, almost falling into a coughing fit due to the exertion.
Well, good then. Keep that attitude, dude. It'll take work, but I'm sure you'll be able to overcome that hate you carry around inside. I believe in you, man.
Inside his helmet, Mark rolled his eyes in annoyed defeat as he groaned in absolute irritation for taking the bait. It was something he'd encountered in prison many times. He should have known better.
Anyway,
Crip continued.
They come in all kinds of varieties.
Who do? Supreme asked.
Well, the Sasquatches and Bigfoots. I mean, if I was to say Ice Bigfoot, what comes to mind?
Supreme paused, thinking on it, as one might a bar trivia question before his eyebrows shot up in a delightful insight. A Yeti! He exclaimed, clearly proud for making the connection.
Exactly. I forget who goes where otherwise, but I know Bigfoot and Sasquatch are supposed to be from different parts of the country. But anyway, you should go fight a Yeti.
Crip grinned as this stone train of thought, amidst a stream of consciousness improv, finally yielded some humorous endgame. Fight a Yeti? But why? He's not a bad guy, right?
He could be. Legend has it, it's torn hikers and mountaineers to pieces over the years for being in his territory,
Crip argued.
Innocent people, you know?
Supreme thought on this as deeply as his mind would allow. But isn't that just like him defending? Supreme began, before being cut off.
Let's use it, or they, them, here. No need to presume his gender.
Crip just couldn't stop himself. Yeah, okay, sorry. So, it's that just like it...
Them!
Crip said, needlessly correcting him for the sake of the bit. Oh, okay, so, isn't that just them defending, their territory?
It could be. Or it could be that.
Crip faltered and paused, realizing he didn't have a joke lined up.
They just love the taste of human flesh. And climate change. They're pissed about climate change.
They eat people? Supreme asked in shock.
Sure, yeah. They can't get enough of us. Especially hikers, because they're all muscles and full of wheatgrass juice or something. And it's all because of climate change.
That sounds pretty monster-like. Might say villainous, Supreme replied, now comfortable that a hero element had been reintroduced into the conversation.
Yeah, you could say that. And you could also say that if one guy was able to both beat up a Yeti and prove that they're real at the same time, won't really matter what shit people say about him on the internet, or on podcasts, or on stage.
Crip agreed. Supreme thought on the accolades he could earn with this one battle. Crip, he felt, was quite convincing, between his cousin's account and his clear understanding of their pronouns. Supreme had never thought about pronouns seriously before, seeing them as goofy internet stuff. But as he'd never met a Sasquatch, or a Bigfoot, or a Yeti before, he realized he really didn't know what their whole sex and gender thing might be about. And after all, he was trying to be a hero for all people. So minding things people regarded as sensitive was probably a good look to go after. But the idea was there. With his speed and enhanced senses, he reasoned that if anyone could catch a Yeti, it would be him. And should the ferocious man-eater put up a fight, he could present its broken body to the world as proof that he slew the monster. Maybe he could do it on Hogan, he thought to himself. That would be cool. Okay, so, where would I find a Yeti? Specifically. I know it's like up in Alaska, near the North Pole or something, right? Once more, Supreme began speaking before realizing he didn't know what he was talking about.
Yeah, way up there in the frozen north. But remember, they're pissed because their habitat is shrinking. Because of?
Yeah, climate change. I get it. They're hippies or something, Supreme replied, brushing the matter off as he focused on the fantasy of defeating the Yeti and making history. Crip let the bit go.
So you think you're ready for the challenge there, big guy?
He smiled broadly as he spoke, the last chance to avoid the raucous laughter building up inside of him. I am. Mark spoke up then. Are you fucking kidding me? Dude, the guy is fucking with you.
No, I'm not.
Crip replied quickly. Yeah, you fucking are. There's no such thing as a Yeti.
How do you know? Have you been to the Great Frozen North? Canadian Siberia, as it's called by the natives?
Crip shot back.
The fuck are you talking about? Nobody calls it that! Are you calling the Inuit people's traditions wrong?
Crip asked, shooting Mark a very obvious side-eye.
What?
No! Fuck you, dude! I'm not a fucking racist.
I'm not here to judge. I'm here to help,
Crip replied, with an unnervingly genuine look of concern and compassion. Mark laid his head back, shaking it from side to side in defeat. He'd met his fair share of jokers in prison as well, and knew when they were on a wind-up mission, there was no stopping them. He sighed and pulled a sip from his piss hose, while reviewing his life's misdeeds, wondering what forces of cynical cosmic justice had put him in such a position as this.
So, Supreme, are you ready to make history?
Crip asked, returning his attention to the living meme before him. Supreme nodded, his eyes steely and filled with misplaced and ill-defined resolve. I am, he said, puffing his chest. Let's do this. As Supreme rocketed through the air on a northwestern trajectory, a pair of highly skilled and underpaid engineers sat at their stations, deep below the Earth's surface at an undisclosed location. Their names were Dennis and Tim. When they would head to work each day, both would take a city bus from the small nondescript company town they lived in, and after a short walk from their stop, they would wait on the street corner near a derelict newspaper box. While there, they would chat idly about nothing in particular while waiting for the blacked-out SUV to arrive and take them on the final leg of their daily sojourn. Once it did, the two would smile as the large man in dark suits and sunglasses who would emerge each day, greet them with a good morning, and then tilt their heads forward to accept the black bags they would wear over their heads for the remainder of their commute. Initially, upon starting at the facility, the men in the SUV would typically be silent, stoic, and would perform their duties without a word. But after 3 or 4 months of driving, their charges to and from the drop point, and hearing them chat freely as co-workers, both men had come to know the driver as Dwayne and his partner as Eric. Eric had been a Marine and had served in Iraq. To hear him tell it, he had been selected for special service in his current department after personnel review by the Marine Corps. He was deemed too smart and too capable to be wasted as a grunt. In reality, following a completely ordinary, and by ordinary it is of course implied complicated and bothersome separation from the military, Eric had inadvertently applied to an ad he found on Craigslist seeking a discreet private driver, only to be hired by a shadowy organization that was clearly government-funded and privately run. He knew better than to ask questions. Dwayne, as it turned out, had answered the same online classified ad seeking discreet drivers. However, he had what his father would tell him to say in his interview, private sector experience. This experience had been working as a driver in security for a trio of private party strippers who would sometimes take their service offerings to broader levels than advertised on their website. Dwayne's father, an ex-cop, taught him terms such as executive protection and confidential transportation. After lying extensively on his resume and applying through the website, being invited to sit down with the over-caffeinated HR rep and recite what he'd been trained to say felt like winning the lottery. His previous driving experience notwithstanding, his career path until that point had been largely comprised of call centers and retail cashier experiences. His father's tutelage and advice helped significantly both during his application process and interview, and before he knew it, Dwayne got to ride shotgun in a very fancy truck, in a very fancy suit, tailor-made for him by the craftsmen and women at Land's End, with a gun. Dennis and Tim rode comfortably in the back seats as they were accustomed to. Upon hire, having been instructed not to discuss private or personal affairs so as to not compromise security, they tended to keep their conversations topical between one another. They had previously both agreed that they were grateful to their employees for springing for the luxury edition of their daily ride, as the seats felt enveloping and of the highest quality of what they mistakenly believed to be actual leather. Upon mentioning this for the first time, a regular invitation was unintentionally opened with Dwayne about the comfort and quality of their car. "Right? I know," Dwayne said the first time the seats were mentioned, as well as regularly reiterating every time an awkward silence would happen to fall during the ride. "Man, this is some serious class we've got here. Secret agent shit, right?" Dwayne would fill these silences as once he got what seemed like a very positive reaction from the 3 other passengers when making this comment, and sadly, never thought to come up with anything new to say. Eric would nod and roll his eyes behind his standard-issue Oakleys, while Dennis and Tim would look blindly at one another through their blackout bags, nod and murmur something about how comfortable they were, and usually the silence would then resume. Down in their lab, as Dennis and Tim put the finishing touches on the code which would operate their newest project, the sliding glass doors which served as the only ingress or egress from their lab flew open, almost uncharacteristically fast it seemed. Through them stormed the general, cigar tucked between his teeth, with smoke rising into what was supposed to be a clean room. Tim looked up at him from his workstation and saw he was visibly irritable. He was always visibly irritable, but on this precise occasion his irritability seemed to be an extra stride, as though he had enjoyed a hearty breakfast of stubbed toes and divorce papers. Perhaps it was his stormy energy which had scared the automatic doors into opening so fast.
"Where are my goddamn drones?" the general growled.
We're just putting the finishing touches on them now. Should be mission ready in, I don't know, Tim? Dennis replied. I'd say 2 hours, Tim guessed, not appreciating being thrown on the spot like that.
"You have 30 minutes. Are they at least ready for a test?"
asked the general. We could take them for a whirl around the base, I guess. Check to see if the navigational arrays are said Tim, cut off with another smoky growl.
"Then make 'em fucking fly already."
"Show me on that screen." The general gestured to a large monitor that hung over the main workstations. It was in fact the mission control monitor, which provided a whole range of very important flight data for the drones, and was made even more important if more than one was in the air. Dennis motioned as though he was about to explain this to the general, but as the boss's attention was now fully transfixed on the large screen he soon expected to see the drone video on, Tim stopped him, simply switching monitors to avoid problems. Shaking his head, partially at the stupidity of the situation, and partially wondering if he shouldn't have gone to work for Google or Amazon or some other massive evil corporation that was at least publicly traded, Tim input the start codes, and remotely opened a small silo-style hatch in a room down the hall. The hatch led upwards and out of what had been set up to serve as a hangar for numerous green glowing round machines, each the circumference of an extra-large pizza, depending on where you order from. Along their bottoms and along their flanks of their casing, numerous specialized arms were folded neatly into the body, each with their own various functions. Atop the donut-shaped aerial vehicle stemmed 2 stalks, each about 6 inches in length, at the end of which special glowing green camera lenses were mounted, giving the curious appearance of crab's eyes. They were hung along the wall, each within its own small charging cubby. From within their ranks, 2 began to glow brighter, and began levitating out of their cubbies and up towards the bright open sky above. Their eye stalks twitched and scanned around, and the levitating donut drones looked curious and just a bit confused as they did so. Back in the main lab, at the now makeshift observation station, the general watched, brows furrowed, and the stink of his cigar beginning to cause Dennis to choke just a bit. He glared at the video, and then at the engineers, then back to the video again. He huffed and raised an eyebrow, leading both other parties to remain entirely bewildered as to if such was a good or bad thing.
"Why aren't they making that noise?"
the general asked. Noise, sir?" Tim replied.
"You know, the drone noise, that wee sound. That one."
Well, we were given authorization to use some of that technology on loan from the 51 guys who were here last week. So, this uses just gravity. It's silent. Mostly silent, he explained. The general almost smiled at this.
"Silent. I like it. Stealth is key in combat."
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
"You ever been in combat, son?"
the general asked, his eyes now almost glazed over at the sight of a brand new baby weapons platform. No, sir. I can't say I have, Tim replied.
"There's nothing like it. Shows a man what he's truly made of. I remember when my boots hit the ground in Panama. I was just a boy then. No older than you."
I'm 33, sir, Tim interjected,
but to no avail. The enemy was all around us, in the jungle and the foxholes. My uncle was in Nam, told me all about what to expect. I cut the ears off an entire folk band we found hiding while on patrol. It was through that interrogation and the iron will it took to complete that mission that we were able to find the bad guys up the road from our position. We got into some close quarters shit there, son. Bayonets were attached, if you catch my drift.
Of course, sir. Now, if you watch to the left of the screen are the tracking cameras from outside. They'll follow the drone's movements as they fly. The center and right portions are the drone's cameras and sensor readings. Whatever they see, we can see, Tim explained, gently but necessarily steering the conversation back on track.
Very good, mumble-grumbled the general.
As they watched the two green donut drones rise out of their silo and begin hovering above the airy desert floor, each scanned the area with its crab-eye antennae, the flopping, glowing appendages going in different directions, causing the drones to appear almost drunk. The general's right eye twitched with annoyance. Yet in the next moment, just before he was about to grumble about defective wastes of money, something he had considerably more experience with as a command officer than combat throughout his entire military career, something unexpected happened. The drone's eye stalks righted themselves, aligning forward in the way one expects eyes to do. The two drones, though previously hovering randomly about at different heights above the ground, came quickly into a tight diagonal formation, and immediately shot up into the air several hundred feet before coming to a perfect stop. The screen above the observers lit up as sensor data was shown and processed at lightning speed. Tim nodded to Dennis, who nodded knowingly in return, as he began punching commands into the workstation keyboard, and after a moment, several lines of number sequences began populating the sensor screen. The drones turned sharply in place, each of their visual readouts plotting a course along the base. Now we have their codes, so we can track them. But when they go dark, you'll see that none of the base's scanners will pick them up, Dennis explained proudly while pushing a single key. Now they're in autonomous mode, but they know the mission and they will stick to it to the letter. What the general watched next almost brought a tear to his eye, as the two machines raced perfectly at high speed above and around the facility with the precision and grace he could only imagine wielding baby Hellfire missiles. It was as close to adorable as the general was capable of regarding when not in the presence of either his grandchildren or small goats. It would revolutionize warfare. But first, there was the idiot hero to deal with. The general issued his commands.
Deploy them on mission now. I want 2 tracking the primary target, who seems to be in Canada. I want 2 others to go and get my hardware back since the big guy's out for a while.
The wind grew noticeably colder as Supreme blasted through the clouds into the bright open sky and northward, the suspected stomping grounds of the man-eater he sought. Mark had naturally tried to talk him out of it, and almost did, when he pointed out that there were plenty of other real-life bad guys he could be going after. But another word from Crip and a reminder that nothing could ever top discovering and beating the shit out of the Yeti was enough to have him off and into the air. He didn't have much of a plan as to how to search, short of some GPS coordinates he pulled from his phone, highlighting areas of suspected sightings of the beast, which he rocketed towards as best as he could manage. However, after roughly an hour of hurtling over dense forests and eventually snow-covered wilderness, he realized he needed to work the whole matter out a bit deeper if he was to hope for any success. He looked at his phone. He found, generally, that if he dropped down low enough to the ground, he could often find a signal. Supreme quickly found himself frustrated when in the dense Canadian wilderness he found 0 cell service. He scrolled impotently along the now useless navigation app before putting the phone away enough. Before him were heavy, snow-capped trees which extended for as far as the eye could see. Ahead of him, some few miles off, Supreme could see a small mountain, snow ornamenting the tops of any ledges or rock formations along its slope. He hovered there, low beneath the clouds, still and silent. He was beginning to feel like an idiot sent on a wild goose chase. There might not even be a Yeti, and even if there were, how would he find it? The clouds were beginning to grow darker back behind the mountain, and he had no access to his GPS. He tried to think of a solution, a way around this stillness and nothingness he had apparently flown all this way for. Then, from below, down within the impenetrable snow-capped canopy of trees, a noise distracted him. It was a shrill sort of squeal, followed by a grunt. He was easily 100 feet above it, and it wasn't very loud, but he could hear it, and it annoyed him. Looking down with his supreme set of eyes, he found he could peer through the trees and down to the forest floor. There, trudging through knee-deep snow, was an elk. As Supreme listened closer, he noticed that he could hear the creature's steps as they crunched into the snow. He listened closer. He focused, and soon noted the sound of its heavy breaths. A little more attention, and he heard the rhythmic sound of the animal's heart. It was then that an idea occurred to him. If he were to kill the elk in the forest, it would be quiet again, and he could concentrate on devising a solution to his predicament. He was just about to head down to use his laser eyes to cut the beast in half when another, entirely different idea came to mind that didn't involve slaughtering wildlife at all. He would listen for the Yeti. Surely it would have to make some sounds that were different than other creatures. If he could remain still and silent and clear his mind of distraction, he could float along and simply listen for the thing. It reminded him of a hippie girl he had tried to hook up with years ago. I brought him once to a meditation session which he found equally boring and dumb hippie bullshit. Had anyone told him then that one day he would use that hippie bullshit to track down the legendary monster of the snows, the Yeti, he would have probably laughed at them, called them a series of unkind terms, and then left after crop dusting the room. But in that moment, he was distracted with thoughts of the hippie girl, their time together, her yoga pants. It was in that moment, though, the reality and difficulty of actually clearing his mind of anything at all was brought into perspective. So that's why they called it practicing meditation, because you need to work at it to get good at it. It made sense at last. It also, he reasoned, was a dumb and boring waste of time if you weren't hunting Yetis. This could take a while. Mark groaned as Crip wheeled about the warehouse of solitude aimlessly. He was still amused by how easily he had gotten Supreme to just go shooting off in search of the Yeti, but was now wishing he had asked for a lift home first. With no idea how long he might be, there was little to do other than look around, snack on the stacks of junk food, drink hard liquor, or smoke more of Supreme's weed. Crip did each of these precisely in reverse order, but after roughly an hour, the boredom was beginning to set in with sincerity. He wheeled himself up beside Mark, who was as miserable as usual. Crip had found himself wondering just what the metal man looked like under the helmet, but quickly dusted these ponderings upon realizing that this knockoff Master Chief from the game Halo was best thought of as he was, a miserable, writhing bit of metal with a guy inside who clearly made constantly bad choices.
You know, we're actually really the same, you and I,
Crip said to the miserable pile of meat scrap before him. Oh yeah? Mark replied wearily. How's that?
We're both stuck in machines. Machines that let us move about and, live our lives.
Had Crip poured any more sincerity into at least the presentation of his words, his ruse would have been obvious. It was still obvious to Mark, who had given up any hope of this strange crippled comedian being anything close to sincere. Yet still, A pang of understanding rolled through his mind before he quickly dismissed the notion, remembering where he was and who he was talking to. "Fuck you," he said tersely.
No, man. Seriously. Like, I'm not even kidding. I lived my whole life in this chair and will probably die in it. But I don't resent it. Even though I can feel like I'm trapped in it, I see it as the means by which I am made more free. You know?
Crip said, his every word now dripping with a dangerous candor. Mark considered this a moment. "I guess, okay, yeah. Okay, I guess I see it."
I guess the only difference is that I'm not drinking my own piss.
"God damn it," Mark spat. "Let me guess, you only do it when you want to."
Yes, which is never. Which is considerably less piss drinking than you've done. Fuck, at least you've got your legs,
said Crip as he proceeded to spin in place in his chair. "Is there a point to this?"
I'm just saying, if I was you, even if I was dying, which I technically am, I'd still want to walk around and throw cars around or whatever it is you do for fun.
"You have no idea how much agony I am in."
Ah, do you want me to feel sorry for you?
"Just please shut the fuck up." Crip had another barb to throw at Mark, but was distracted suddenly by the sight of something even more peculiar than the rest of his day had been. 2 glowing green drones, with glowing green crab eyes, silently floated in through the open bay door just behind where Mark lay. For the first time all day and in quite a while, Crip was speechless. "Thank fuck," Mark said with a sigh of relief.
Dude? Is it normal for little UFO-looking things to come floating in here?
Crip asked, his eyes glued to the hovering machines which floated closer and closer to Mark. "Yeah, they show up on Tuesdays to play cards with the Jersey Devil. Crip, please, I'm begging you, just shut the fuck..." Mark's words were cut short as he was suddenly rendered immobile. The flying green donuts drones had each deployed a series of tendrils, which, like great predatory snakes, shot themselves into various spots along Mark's suit. There was nothing he could do. He was paralyzed, yet curiously, also very comfortable suddenly. Supreme drifted along slowly through the air, his eyes closed and his ears closely attuned to the sounds of anything at all. He had been at it for roughly 40 minutes, and had now begun the slow zigzagging search pattern he had decided on as he floated up along the mountain's ridges and slopes. The weather had gotten heavier, with thick, blinding snow falling everywhere. The wind howled along what little exposed rock remained. But he was unperturbed. With respect to what he was himself actually capable of, he was a floating Zen master, not properly enlightened, but of a definitively clear mind. Supreme had always been regarded as being dumb growing up. Yet now, here his empty head was proving an asset. As he came up on a broad ridge, which was some 100 feet below a higher cliff and several 100 feet above the earth below, he heard something. It was wholly remarkable. It was unlike anything he had ever heard before, and yet at the same time seemed to convey a message or sense he could understand somewhere deep within himself on a level he couldn't really understand or describe. They were grunts. Heavy, deep grunts. Kind only made by an enormous beast. Yet in the grunts, almost as though it were a form of subtext, Supreme could hear or sense something else. He could hear intent. He could hear frustration. And he could hear a significant number of curse words. He listened closer. He heard then, clear as crystal. And yet, the subtext felt more akin to fuck. He paused and continued listening intently. The growls and grunts, along with the corresponding curses and discontent, only grew louder as Supreme floated on forward, until he could tell he was just above the source. Opening his eyes, he looked down upon the flat ridgeline and cliff face, but saw nothing. Coming to land, he looked about, almost straining his eyes as he attempted to peer through the blinding wall of blowing snow. Yet he could see nothing. Then, from what felt like absolutely nowhere, a large object, roughly the size of a tree, came swinging in and bashed him in the face. The blow sent him flying backwards, causing him to hit the rock wall which was apparently behind him, bringing shards of shattered stone down around him. As he sat up, he had to shake his head a bit to recover from the hit. He hadn't been hit in a way he could feel in what felt like ages, and were it not for the slight discomfort it caused him, he would have almost found it charming. But there was no time for nostalgia or sentiment. Peering through the white, he could finally see him. His opponent, his monster, his yeti. Supreme rose to his feet.
Alright there, big guy.
"You ready for this?" he said, hopping around like a boxer.
Brrrah!
The creature responded, confusing Supreme, as he just felt inexplicably offended on behalf of his mother. The two closed with one another, and brought as much hell as could fit onto that frozen ledge in a furious battle which would shake the mountain.
Chilling tales for dark nights.